I do have probably 3 things to talk about the agenda. So first of all, there's a meeting for juniors at the high school tonight, so Laura has requested to go early so she can leave and get to that meeting. So I'm gonna move the presentation from our student representatives will come right after the consent agenda. Also, Brendan has to leave at 8:30, so I may move the policy discussion depending on how time goes. And finally, I'm gonna add an item to the agenda to talk about holiday treats, baskets for schools. And we'll do that toward the end. Hi, Liz. So, with that, are there, oh, hi, Al. Are there comments from the public on items not on the agenda? Do either of you have comments? No.
No, Martha, thank you.
Okay. All right. Then, does anyone need to pull anything from the consent agenda? Okay, then I'll entertain a motion. Marla, do you want to make that?
I will move that we approve the consent agenda consisting of school board meeting minutes of October 16th, 2018, and approval of warrants.
I'll make the motion.
Marla made the
Outside.
motion.
I get it.
Okay, so
One day.
all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed say nay. Next, as I said, we're gonna move this presentation. So we'll go to the student board representatives, and this is their first opportunity to present to us, so take it away.
So we have a handout for you guys, very official. Just one of those or two, and then if you could grab one and like pass it down. Do you wanna start?
Yeah, so we have 3 things that we wanted to talk about, student voice, PLPs, and flipped classroom. So the first thing on our student report was student voice. So basically last Friday, Laura and I visited ADL, and we talked to some students that were in a World of Difference and also Charger team, which is what used to be called Peer Leadership. And so we talked to them mainly about, or what ended up, the conversation ended up being most about PLPs. And they had a lot of like responses regarding PLPs. Yeah, do you want to just like read some of them, I guess? Or like explain some of them?
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. So a lot of the students were kind of a little bit confused about the whole PLP situation, and a lot of the feedback we got was that they didn't really understand why we need PLPs, and they were saying a lot of their teachers didn't really know either. So they talked a lot about wanting a little bit more kind of direction, and the teachers saying, you know, this is what they're important, like why they're important, this is what we're going to use them for. Then the students were saying, like, if we knew that, then it would really help us when we're making our PLPs and going through that process.
Yeah, so that kind of like lack of like direction, I think they really want more like accountability or like more support from teachers. Like a lot of students voiced that sometimes they would forget the goal that they set, so they would really like it if they could meet more often with their teachers to kind of just like go over their goal and see how they've been doing. I know some students also said that they felt like it was kind of superficial right now because what they've been doing is that they've been answering questions that were kind of like trivia, so like what's your favorite book, or like what do you like to do in your free time, and they felt like PLPs could be better used if they ask students questions about like their personality and like how they can apply like their positive traits to something good. So someone told me that like in a previous year they did like mission statements in one of their classes, and so one student said that he was really creative, so they did like a project with like using art and stuff to kind of like go with that. So I think that's something that we could maybe like consider doing on a wider scale. And also another thing that was brought up was some students said that they were told that PLPs could be used for college. And I know there's like, I like personally, like I don't really see how PLPs could be used for college, like right now, just cause like I'm applying to college and there's nothing on the Common App that says, oh yeah, like attach your PLP. So I guess like it'd be nice if we could get some clarification on that. Yeah. Like we're also setting up times to visit EMS and Westford to talk about PLPs, but also maybe more about student voice too and community engagement, like what can we do to interact with people more. And also with PLPs, like Laura and I are hoping to visit some other schools in the district. So like Winooski does a lot with iLab and also like PLPs too. So we want to just see how they do it and see how we can maybe apply that to our school. Yeah.
Yeah. And also talking about like having kids do PLPs from 6th to 12th grade, a lot changes in that time for kids. And I think that one of the things that would be cool is I took computers and careers last year and we did the Myers-Briggs personality test. And if that's a more in-depth thing that kids can put on their PLP, like we should do it every year so they can, or every few years so they can see how they've progressed as a person, and then it's more meaningful to them, which is awesome. Anything else or?
Yeah, I think that's kind of like it for like PLPs and student voice. So yeah, we're just trying to get more like student feedback and also see how other schools are doing it, just because like we're still starting out with PLPs. And I think Laura's gonna talk about flipped classroom now.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about it with the students at ADL.
Yeah.
We were mostly focused on PLPs. But we were talking about how a flipped classroom is where you do like the lesson, you watch it outside of school in a video for your homework, and then you come into class and you kind of review the notes if you took them, go over like really quickly review, and then do what would have been the homework except more in-depth and more engaging, so students are learning the material with a lot of support from teachers and other students. So, and I was hoping that my government teacher does this, and I was hoping that she could come in and give like a brief presentation on flipped classroom, because I think it would be really beneficial to try and implement it into a lot of other classrooms.
Yeah, so I think Laura wants to get that like on the agenda, like possibly for like next
Yeah.
meeting or the meeting after, something like soon. Yeah. Yeah, so I guess like, do you guys have any questions?
Brent?
So in a flipped classroom, is that every class, or is that just some classes that are
That's
managed that way?
every class.
Oh.
Yeah.
actually remember 6th grade, when I did 6th grade math teacher did that as well. Mr. Wiedebeck had recorded lessons at night, and I'd hear them listening to them, and they'd be doing their homework together in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting.
Other questions or comments?
I just thank you for the report. I love this part of the board meeting, and I really look forward to your report. So thank you for doing that, and the reach out, what you're doing with the other schools, I think is excellent, and so thank you for that.
I think we've got future administrators sitting over there. That's for sure.
I love-
After they see what administrators go through.
Scare them away.
Kim?
I appreciate your conversations with our buildings, and I also love the idea of talking to students around their experiences in other schools, because I know what we all intend to hopefully have happen with the efforts that happen around PLPs or whatever other body of work we're doing, but intention and then how it's received and what it's experienced as for students is often different. And so our administrators might already have been talking with administrators from other schools around their implementations around PLPs, but I think the student voice from other schools would really help better understand where there's been some successes and where there might be some suggestions for improvement. And then having a teacher come share with us, it may or may not be like an immediate future agenda thing, but I think thinking about it in the context, because it would be helpful for board understanding, but not board action necessarily. But I think especially if it were to fit into some other broader question that aligned with something else, that would be, I always think it's awesome to hear about some of the innovative stuff happening in our classrooms. So thank you.
One question, when you were talking with students about PLPs, I understand you wanted more support from the teachers. Students didn't understand the process. Do you have any feedback from the administration regarding how that would be completed?
Like changing the process of PLPs?
Possibly.
Well, I know we talked to Mrs. Wood.
Yeah, very briefly.
Yeah, and it seemed like she was already aware of some of the problems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, I think we might be meeting with like Beth to talk about it too a little bit. And I know that I think she's been talking to Mrs. Wood also. Yeah, regarding like the feedback.
But I feel like a lot of these are like simple changes that can make a really big difference. Just having teachers kind of check in more often, or just changing the questions a little bit. I feel like that would be kind of an easy change.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So you guys would both be doing your PLPs as well. So how do you find it in your experience doing it yourself as students participating?
I don't think it was ever, like, it was never that, it never felt important. It was just kind of like one of those things that you do to move forward. And then we did it a lot in middle school. We checked in on it a couple times. And then my freshman and sophomore year, we didn't visit it at all. And then junior year, they came back with another About Me page. And then it was the same questions, like what's your favorite book, or even just the broadest one, like tell us about yourself, which is, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
But I feel like it never, like it didn't have a huge impact for me.
I mean, I think for me, like when the students said, "Oh yeah, we don't get a lot of teacher support," I definitely felt that, because I know. I think we were just maybe told one day, "Oh yeah, just fill this out. It'll take 10 minutes," and then they never said like specifically what needed to be on it or like what the purpose was. Yeah, and also I know some students said, "Oh yeah, why are we doing an About Me page if this is just being shown to like our parents and maybe our teachers? Like they already know what our favorite color is. They already know what we like to read. Like it's kind of useless." So I guess maybe something like with changing the About Me page. Yeah, and also I guess maybe changing like teacher attitudes towards PLPs, because I feel like teachers have a really big effect, because if teachers are passionate, then students might also like follow that example, and they might also be super into PLPs. So I think it's like partially like short-term quick solutions and some like greater long-term action that needs to be taken.
Andre.
So Grace, you touched upon with the college applications, no one that you applied has asked about the PLP or
No.
or the opportunity
I mean,
to.
I guess like technically you could put it in the additional information section,
Yeah.
but I think people interpret that more for like, do you have any like extenuating like circumstances or like family illnesses? So I don't think anyone is really putting their PLP in that section. Yeah.
Interesting, but that doesn't prevent you from giving it to them, though, right?
Yeah, it doesn't, but also like seniors, like we've only done the About Me page, so
Yeah.
they wouldn't really see anything new. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I wonder if for some people their PLP might be more like a portfolio, or maybe one day it's supposed to be kind of like that. I actually don't know much about it as a parent or otherwise, so maybe that's the intent. But if you guys don't know the intent, then I think it's probably something's not gone all the way through.
Yeah.
But that's the only thing I could guess, that maybe if it becomes robust, it is more like a portfolio that might be shared of
Yeah.
your work that you've been proud of or something.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who's like applying like with music supplements, like they have very specific like requirements, and they also have their own system for doing that. So you wouldn't necessarily like attach your like bulb and be like, oh yeah, check out these recordings. Like you would put it on their slide room. And I think maybe what we should like focus on is maybe like defining the goals of PLPs more specifically, because we're interpreting a law that the state passed, but it's a very general law, and we should make it more specific for like our purposes. Yeah.
So I'll be interested to see if there are differences when you talk to students from other schools. I have to say personally, it's slightly disturbing that this whole process isn't being framed better. To me, the whole point is that there's research that says when students focus on what they want their future to be, and they plan for that future, and they can show the work that is leading them to that future, then they're more likely to be successful. And some students are doing that naturally as part of their life, because they have parents who guide them, or teachers or whoever. But I'm disturbed to hear that it isn't clear what the purpose is and why you do the various steps within the PLP. I do think it's confusing because we've had lots of stops and starts, and there's been different levels of implementation in different schools. So,
and different decision-making processes for selecting tools,
exactly.
for working on it. I mean, we're year 2 in a unified district, and when Eric came, at least we've got, for those, and as a senior, it's gonna be really hard to reboot a program and have it be really impactful in that last 9 months of your career. But as we have the 6th graders coming up and 7th graders, the idea that bulb doesn't stop at 8th grade and then you pick up another About Me page and you start all over again, to have that continuum is promising, and there's a lot for us to learn and improve upon. I mean, we'd want to be further along. I think that's the expectation, but it's, that rebooting is really what Eric talked about, and then having the services of Ellen Thompson, really dedicating it, getting the training going, and trying to do it for about 2,000 students.
So, other questions or comments? Thank you both very much, and I really look forward to your next report. Okay, Dylan.
Yeah, so Dylan McNamara, I think most of you know him. He's the co-director of Student Support Services, and presented this same information back on October 17th to the Ed leadership team of the district, and is providing it to the board, both an overview as well as some specifics. So, yeah.
So thanks for having me tonight. I think it's important that we do have this kind of initial conversation about Act 173. It's a pretty significant act that has some pretty big implications, and we're all trying to unpack it right now. I know directors from around the state they're trying to wrap their head around the implications of this, and so as we work through this, you'll see that there's certainly a lot of clarity with some pieces of this act, and then there's a lot of details to be worked out as well, and so we'll talk a bit about that. But the first thing I want you to do is just pay attention to the title, and this is actually right out of the statute. It's an act relating to enhancing the effectiveness, availability, and equity of services provided to students who require additional support. It does not say that, Special Ed Funding Act. So people will say, oh, the new Special Ed funding rule. It certainly has implications to how we use our funding for special ed, but it's a much broader act than that, and in that sense, it's a positive act in the sense it gives us a lot of flexibility with addressing the needs of students who need extra support, whether or not they're on an IEP or not. So we're gonna talk about these 5 things today, and then I know that service plan is on the agenda too, so I'm going to touch on where we are with our service plan, but that's at the tail end of this because I want us to kind of have some context around kind of this act and implications moving forward. So again, that's the title. The title was before, but it's really around enhancing the effectiveness, availability, and equity of services provided to all students who require additional support. These can include students who have an IEP. We are still obligated to meet those needs under federal rules, federal regulations, and state rules. That obligation has not gone away, as well as students who need accommodations under Section 504. But in addition to supporting those students, this act provides a level of flexibility to look at other students who may be negatively impacted by social, emotional, or behavioral issues, students who are learning English, or other students who are below grade level with reading. So the focus really is on in that content area, knowing that that's the gateway for success for students. This act just didn't come out of the blue. There was some history to it in terms of there's been a couple studies recently done at the state level that looked at special education funding as well as service delivery models. So the UVM study was completed last spring, and that looked at our current funding model as well as made suggestions around how to save money and how to provide flexibility around innovative services. And then the DMG report that I think we presented on last year was also done across the state, and there were several recommendations made and implications from that. So what the UVM study essentially did is they looked at our funding model that exists today. They compared it to other states across the country as well as other states in New England. And they looked at how do we stack up in terms of how we fund special education in terms of total dollars and in terms of our model. What they identified were the highlights here on the left side is that what we have right now is administratively costly, meaning there's a lot of requirements in terms of time documentation, in terms of justification, those types of things, that we spend a lot of time and resources just on managing the rules associated with the current funding system. The folks from UVM also talked about, your current system is siloed. You can only focus on students who are on IEPs with those funds, and that's not congruent with multi-tier system of support and some of the broader frameworks that the Agency of Ed is trying to support districts with. So they said you've got this contrast between the way you fund your work and what you aspire to do, and they pointed that out pretty clearly. They also talked about that the reimbursement model, that's the current model that we're under, sometimes can incentivize spending and not sort of quell spending. In other words, if I have a student, Brian, if I spend $20,000 on services, I get 56% back from the state. If I spend $40,000, I get 56% back. So it's proportional to what you spend, which is helpful for a district, but it doesn't always encourage innovation or efficiencies. And it's also unpredictable because from year to year, as we try to forecast our budget, we use the service plan to give our best guess on what we're going to spend the next year. But our revenue, as you guys know, if you've been doing this for a while, fluctuates. And so sometimes we bring in more revenue than we thought, and other times we bring in less. And so it's sort of it's a bit of a guessing game. And so from a budgeting standpoint, it creates some challenges. So what they recommended was more of a census-based model, which actually I think was in place years and years ago and is in place in some states. And we're going to talk in detail about what that looks like. But as well as a census-based model, they said, we think that that the funding model should give districts more flexibility in how they use their funds. We feel like they should be able to use it for early intervention in students who are struggling. It should be a simpler model than what exists today, and it should align with the priorities like MTSS. DMG, when they did their study, they basically said, hey, we've got some pretty important recommendations. And they're not recommendations for one district or another. We studied 10 school districts, and these are some common themes that we noticed. Based on that, they said, you guys need to make sure that core instruction meets the needs of most students. So Nate Levinson actually wrote a book called Smarter Schools, Smarter Budgets, I think, a few years ago. And he actually said this well before the DMG study. He said, you want to save money in special education, invest in core instruction. Invest in what's happening in the classroom every day, and you will prevent a lot of challenges long term and a lot of expenses long term. And that's really what he said too here in Vermont. He and his group who did the study said you need to invest in core instruction. You also need to, what we know from research is that some kids just need additional time. They don't need necessarily something different in terms of a different program or a super duper specialist with a cape. They just need more time with that classroom teacher. I was at a great training last year from that VCSEA put on, and there was a specialist in the area of literacy, and she said, what we know is that even when you have a top-notch literacy program for kindergartners, 20 to 30% of those kids are gonna need about 20 or 30 minutes extra a day. And they'll get it, but they need that. So when you have a model that doesn't provide extra time, that's linked directly to core instruction, and it's more around, well, once they aren't doing well, we refer them to a specialist, that's not a real effective model. And DMG clearly said that, like, you need to figure out how to provide more time with some kids instead of just a special intervention. And that can't be in place of core instruction. It needs to be in addition to. So we don't want to take Brian out of his reading class to give him support in reading. We want him to be present in reading, especially you think at the younger ages, and then we want to do what we call double dosing. And so that recommendation was very clear. Also, make sure that you are using highly skilled teachers to provide instruction. That seems like a no-brainer, but in Vermont, we do have a habit of using a lot of staff to support students in their IEPs, and while it is helpful in terms of supervision and in terms of redirection and accommodations, it's often not providing that specialized instruction that kids need with the current model in Vermont. In terms of behaviors, they didn't say you need to do PBIS, but what they said is you should have a system-wide approach to supporting behaviors in your schools, and you should have somebody in your school should have some expertise around behavior to support kids. We do know that we have, across Vermont and across the nation, more students with emotional and behavioral challenges, and we need to make sure that we have the expertise that the school has to support those kids, as well as other kids with intensive needs. So if you think about the UVM study kind of critiquing the current funding model, and the DMG study kind of critiquing the current service delivery model, that's what was the impetus for 173. They said we need to look at how we fund schools, and we need to look at how they use those funds. And we need to kind of remove some of the barriers that currently exist. So that's a real positive thing from Act 173. There's still a lot of work to be done with it. There's an advisory group that's meeting this year, and they are working out some of the kinks in terms of how to phase the funding changes in over time, how to provide technical assistance to districts to make system-level change. And they also, most importantly, they're reopening the special education rules. Because right now, our current rules, they're like almost 300 pages. It's a book of the state rules, if I've ever seen them. Within that book, there's about 20 pages that speak to what is defined as a special education expense. And so right now, we're kind of locked into only using that money according to the rules. So they've realized that the rules need to be reopened and reworked to give us flexibility that's consistent with Act 173. So those rules will be opened this year within the legislature, and I'm sure you'll hear some things in the media around that. And again, the AOE is trying to hire an attorney as well as other folks to provide technical assistance, and so they're working hard to kind of scale up their ability to support school districts. The things we know that are changing now for sure, so that while there are kinks to be worked out, we know that the way that we fund schools will change. So right now, we get, between our grants and the reimbursement model, we get approximately 60% of every dollar we spend back. Again, whether we spend 10 million or 20 million, that's what we get back. We get, in addition to the SEER that we file every year, that documents what we spend. We get a percentage of that reimbursement, and we get these grants here. Main Street Block Grant, and we also have an IDEA B grant, which is a federal grant. And then there's called extraordinary service reimbursement. So for any time we spend over $50,000 on a particular student, we have to file a report, and we get a higher percentage back for those expenses. So without getting in the weeds too much, those are the way we're funded currently.
Can we ask a question? The IDEA B federal grant, is that included in the 60% or not? And is that, how that's used, gonna be affectable by Act 173 or not?
We'll continue to get the federal grant. It's not necessarily included in that. We get about $1 million in our school district from the federal government, and that will still be present. There are some strings attached to that in terms of how we use that money, but that will still be present for sure. We tend to currently use that to fund a lot of our preschool special education services. So we can get real detailed, and if you're good at math, it'll make sense, and if you're not good at math, your head may be spinning a little bit. But let me try to explain kind of the paradigm shift. Starting in fiscal year 21, the state will replace the block grant and the percentage increase with a census-based grant. So it'll be, think about, for every student you have in your district, you'll get X number of dollars. Not for every student that's on an IEP, but for every student that's in your district, you'll get a set amount of dollars. So how are they going to calculate that? Well, that's going to be called the uniform base rate. We'll jump here first. And the way they're going to calculate that is they're going to look at, on average, what did school districts spend per student across FY 18, 19, and 20. So they'll basically look at the state average across those 3 years. So we can't give you those numbers yet because that hasn't happened, right? We're still over here. We can start to make some estimates based on historical trends, which is what we're trying to do. But that uniform base rate is yet to be determined. We have a sense of where it may be. They'll also calculate where we are as a district across 17, 18, and 19. So they're going to bring us back in time a little bit at the district and say, what did you spend 17, 18, 19? I think they actually did this because they didn't want people to spend, like knowing that this act was going to come, spend a lot in FY 19 and 20. And that's going to be kind of your personal average, right? So you've got the state average, you've got yours. And then they're going to say, all right, so for FY 21, what we're going to do is we're going to give you your average that you spent across these 3 years, plus an NIPA, which is like the CPI adjustment. Brian can get into details of the math for that if you want. But that's what they're going to give us in FY 21. And then they're going to phase us over several years to FY 25 to this uniform base amount. So if you're spending less than average, you could see some modest increase. If you're spending more, you could see a modest decrease depending on where you are. Does that make sense before we go to the next slide?
Is that gonna be like a rolling average, similar to the CTE tuition that we charge, or, because every fourth year there will be an adjustment?
So the ADM will be however they calculate
So
the
that-
ADM, which is a
2-year rolling average.
But that'll change year to year based on your ADM.
Yep. So
So
if you got 100 more, if they're going to give you $4,000 per student, and your ADM goes up, you would get more money next year.
But then if it goes down the following year,
Yeah.
you're going down.
And there's talk right now, they're looking at should they also apply a second layer of adjustment for that. So for example, if you're a district that has a high level of poverty, should you actually get more than that uniform base rate based on what we know about so those are the things that the advisory group is looking at.
Right now, it's work in progress.
Work in progress.
Thank you.
Okay.
Do you have a sense of to what extent the adjustment to ADM based on weighted students is going to play into this, and whether that project, other than being in study, is, so
So ADM
isn't weighted?
No.
What number is weighted? Something's weighted. Equalized pupil.
Equalized.
Okay, something's weighted. Sorry about
And
that.
by the time they re-weight the weighting,
We will be waiting a long
well,
time.
they weight it, but then they have to bring it back down to the number. So, you know, it is a bit of a waiting to then unweight others to create nearly the same math. I mean, it just comes, when it
So
tries
it's
to
straight
solve
up a
back
head
to.
count.
Yeah. But there, you know, there's a couple of pieces of math in here of your average spending, plus what your average ADM is, and then each one of those able to change over time, and it's ADM, not students receiving services
Right.
per se.
So
And you can see that automatically, you're kind of going back in time for FY '21. If you just think that FY '18 is, maybe that's your average, what you spend. You're, in FY '21, that's what the state's gonna give you, plus the NIPA, but that's less than typically what you would go over from 18 to 21. So the other thing that's tricky with this, the way the rule is written is, it says that they're gonna calculate this, the uniform base amount, as stated, and they're gonna apply an NIPA to that as well. It's unclear whether they're gonna apply an NIPA to that, an adjustment once, and put that in FY '25 and work you to it, or if they're gonna actually increase that each year. I reached out to the Agency of Ed to get clarity on that, and they said, good question, you're right, it's not clear, something that the advisory group needs to look at. It has pretty significant implications. If you think about over 5 years, if you say it's 3%, you increase something 3% over 5 years versus hold it stable. So this next slide kind of tries to reflect a couple different scenarios. So again, this is the uniform base amount. This is the average, again, of 18, 19, 20, plus NIPA across the state. And this is just an example, so here's my disclaimer. These are not 100% accurate numbers because we don't have all the years, but we wanted to put something up there. If we look at where we are across the state, if we hypothesize where things will move, this is probably somewhere near where that will be, $4,200. And if we look at where we've been as a district, we're slightly above that. And part of it is, when you see the service plan, is most of our budget is salaries and benefits. We pay more in Chittenden County, so just by default, we end up higher. That's certainly a factor. So if they keep this stable and say you need to work toward this, that has very significant implications. If you start to multiply this number over our ADM. If they bump this up each year, it's a little bit more palatable, right, as a district, to be like, okay, like we need to work within that. So we don't know where it's going to be yet, but what we do know is that historically we have spent a little bit more than average, the state average, and our increase typically is in education, which is why a lot of this talk around education spending is going on at state level. Our increase typically does outpace the NIPA or the CPI. So best case scenario, I would say that it will cap our rate of growth to a more what's deemed to be a sustainable level from the state, and then we'll have to make decisions at the district level around how we fund things. Worst case scenario, they'll cap it here and hold it steady, and it would lead to more financial pressures for districts across the state. Does that make sense of how those two things could play out?
And I assume the extraordinary situations will be handled separately outside of this.
Did you read this presentation?
I did
before?
not.
Tell
Is
you.
that okay?
I am going to cover that because there's still, that was a concern, and that is, there's still a clause around students who have extraordinary cost, right? Because that could, especially a small district, that could sink them. But we'll talk about that. There's some minor changes with that. So what is changing? While we continue to, we must use the funds again to provide services outlined in the IEPs, and we must ensure compliance with IDEA fiscal requirements, the federal requirements. So if we don't change our practice at all, we more than likely won't have any funds freed up around being preventative and being more innovative. If we can start to come back to the drawing board and look at our service delivery model, which I think we owe it to everybody to do across the state, and find some efficiencies or find some more innovative ways to meet the needs of kids, we could conceivably free up some funds to do some other things. And those are listed here to really support early intervention and MPSS. Kim, this is your question, is the extraordinary cost. Right now, the threshold is $50,000, and one of the things that the legislatures did not like was the fact that that's been $50,000 forever. It hasn't changed. And so what they said is, you know what, it needs to bump up. So starting next year, that bumps up to $60,000. So that means that you only, right now, we're reimbursed a certain percentage up to that, and then every dollar over $50,000, we get 90% back. It's bumping to 95%. So that just says, but we're gonna raise the threshold to 60,000, and they're actually gonna increase that every year with NIPA. And then every dollar you spend over that, you'll get 95%. Now the difference is with the census grant, we'll only get $4,200 theoretically for that kid, for the first 60,000. Right now, we get 56%, right? But we'll get $4,000 for every kid in the system. So it's a little different. What else is changing? We'll have an increased ability to predict revenue, right? We'll still want to do something like the service plan because we have to from a budget standpoint. It's a good practice for us to work through. But we won't have to submit that level of detail to the state because they're going to say, here's your ADM, here's how much money we're going to give you. It'll make our job easier in terms of forecasting revenue. But we will likely see a decrease in funding from the state, and I'm not putting that in permanent marker yet, but it's clear that either scenario, based on our history, we're likely to see less. Again, we still are obliged to provide services as outlined. The federal government, the federal requirements is that at the state level, they maintain, it's called MOE, or maintenance of effort. They have to continue to maintain their funding for special ed, which is why they're saying, here's the state average, here it is. So they're not making big cuts. They're like, this is it, and we're gonna keep it steady. But at the local level, we have to do that too. And if we don't continue to invest the same level that we have the year before, then our federal grant is in jeopardy to some extent. So if you say we're gonna spend $500,000 less in local dollars for special ed, the feds will say, well, we're gonna give you $500,000 left in your federal grant because they don't want you to supplant what you're doing with their funds. So that's currently how it's written. By the rules being rewritten and what is a special ed expense being redefined, that will give us more flexibility though in how we spend that money. So in other words, if we can get innovative, creative, and efficient, we still have to spend what we're spending from the previous year, but we can do it differently. State place revenue still exists. Those are for students who are in state custody and they're placed in foster care. Here, we actually we get 100% of those costs back when we fill out the report. Excess cost billing, those are students who are in a different district who tuition in. So if we have folks from the islands come down, we can bill out for those. And then we have grants for our early childhood special education programs. Those continue to exist as is. So those things are not changing. So what are the big takeaways? I could have just started with this, but I wanted you to have a little detail. It does encourage flexibility and innovation, which I think is exciting. It connects to some of our other strategies and frameworks across the state and some things we're trying to do in the district. Less documentation, pretty transparent and clear with budgeting. And it certainly does break down our silos. Right now we have, can I do that? I'm a special educator. Can I work with this kid? Or is that an eligible expense? And so that kind of conversation can get pushed to the side, which is a good thing for kids. There's still a lot of details to be worked out, and again, there's potentially less funding, which are some potential challenges. I did talk about that it connects to some things around the state, but it also directly connects to our continuous improvement plan and our vision and our theory of action. So, I pulled this graphic up. I think Amy presented this to you previously, but what's nice is you can see a lot of what we're striving to do around high quality first instruction and quality tier 2 interventions, equitable access, social emotional support, and school structures and staffing. These are things we're already saying that we're committed to work on. So while there may be some financial pressure, there's also some flexibility that allows us to think outside the box more than we ever have before. So that's good. Again, this also connects to the work we're doing with budget forecasting. The leadership, the school leaders, and at the school level, we're starting to continue to unpack DMG and look at those recommendations. And so this allows us to do that without those barriers. We are continuing to do some work around what is our comprehensive intervention system we have in place. You know, right now we have math and literacy interventionists. We also have special educators. We have some paras that provide support. So we're kind of like, let's wipe the board clean and reimagine what a comprehensive intervention system would look like. And so we're starting that work, and this is helpful. And then within the special ed world, we're also, Aaron and I are doing some leadership work with our, on the once a month on those early release Tuesdays around calibrating our approach and those types of things. And so we're bringing this into it. Now to get to the real exciting stuff is the service plan. So while this requirement will go away in a couple of years, we still live with it. I wanted to put up two numbers for you, just so you could see. This is the special ed expenditure report that was filed in August, I think August 15th probably. And this shows that this is how much we spent in FY18. So our first year as a merged district, we spent just shy of $16 million K-12 and $940,000, $941. That's early childhood special education. You may be used to the acronym EEE, but this is the new acronym, even though the AOE keeps using EEE, they tell us this is what we're supposed to do. I'm using it. Now, this is next year, so this is really a 2-year difference, right? This is what we spent last year. This is what we believe we're on track to spend next year, if we don't do anything different than from what is currently identified as needs. A little bit over 17 million, and this number actually came down due to some particular circumstances. So that's held pretty steady. If you do the math, this is just shy of a 7% increase over 2 years, so about 3.5% a year on average. That's assuming we're accurate with this number. Again, we're looking at everything now and projecting what we'll spend next year, which is, we're generally pretty accurate, but there can be a lot of change. And this just gives you the detail of how that breaks down. I just put a couple arrows here because you can see these are the big ticket items, right? So teacher salaries, aide salaries, so this is the paras, and then employee benefits. The way the service plan works, it's weird. They have you lump all the benefits in the one line here, and then they have you put your SLPs down here with their benefits. So the point here, though, is that it's heavy staff. I mean, you can see between these numbers, this is the bulk of the service plan is staff, people. While we spend some money on supplies and materials, you know, $73,000 out of a $17 million budget is a pretty small percentage, but staff is really what drives it. And then preschool is very similar. So our early childhood special ed is a different budget. You know, obviously at only 135, but again, you look, it's really your teachers and your SLPs. So that's how that breaks down. I just thought it was helpful to appreciate that, because if we're going to make significant changes, it means that we have to evaluate our staffing structure, because we're not gonna save a lot of money by cutting, you know, $6,000 in books or even $70,000. That's a very small percentage. So we are committed to looking at that for sure. So what questions? You guys asked some questions along the way, but
I have 7 questions.
7.
I'll only ask 3. So, presumably, if we improve core instruction, then we might not need as much support from paras. And so that would be, the assumption is that improving core instruction will result in a staffing reduction in the para or the aid area.
That's one area. I mean, potentially one area. I think there's several areas,
Yeah.
right? So if you think about early intervention, you could also need less special educators, perhaps, less SLPs, perhaps, less
Right.
transportation, perhaps. So
Okay.
there's a lot of different areas. And folks have been saying that for a while. If you allow us to invest with early intervention, we can save money. So now it's our turn to prove it.
Right. Second question. So thinking about how the board can support this work, one of the questions I have is, I'm wondering about, does improving core instruction mean that the board should allocate more money for professional development?
I think that we're gonna have to invest more in professional development. We can talk about what that looks like, right? Like, is that coaching?
Right.
But yes, I do, and we've talked about that at leadership too, in terms of, can we find efficiencies in our budget this year so that we can reinvest in that very type of thing.
Right.
That core instruction is so central with teacher efficacy,
Yeah.
which is so central to the early release and the idea that we can have the professional learning communities work together so that we can do that. So that's part of it as well.
Okay. Final question?
Sure.
We're beginning contract negotiations, and so I'm starting to wonder to myself, does the idea of changing the way that we approach special education, and if that includes a significant investment in core instruction and professional development, are there any considerations that we need to be making at the negotiations table with regard to with teacher contracts? And maybe that's not a question you can answer in this moment, but it's
Yeah.
just on my mind, like, does that change any of the dynamics or some of the things that we're looking to have a discussion about at the negotiation table?
I think it does. I don't know how much detail we want to get into, but I think there's certainly implications around professional development in terms of, and I think time is a valuable commodity that we're still stuck in a pretty traditional school day. I don't want to go off script too much, but a traditional school year. And when I think about that point that some kids just need more time with that skilled teacher, maybe it's the same teacher. Like, why do we want to introduce a kindergartner yet another adult to build a relationship with? If they have a good kindergarten teacher that's providing quality instruction and they just need more time, how do we create a way to do that with that teacher, for example? And so that is thinking about flexibility in contracted time, days, year, calendars. I think we have to be able to brainstorm a lot of different ideas that include playing with that concept. I think that continues to be a barrier for us, not just here, but across the state and the country.
Thank you.
Keely?
So my question is kind of related to Brendan's second question. Thinking about efficiency and staffing, of course, like with the percentage of people that work in our district who also live in our district, I think it'd be really great if, in addition to professional development for our core teachers, that if we are thinking we need fewer instructional assistants or one-to-one support, shadowing students around, but we need more of a certain type of supportive instruction, is there a way that we can help people who are currently paras move into the roles that we will need?
Yep. I think that's something, that's definitely something we should look at. I do think that when I think about some of the skills that kids need, we have a lot of competent people right now that could do that with the right coaching and support. Absolutely.
Or the right
Yep.
subjects, studies, or whatever.
But I think of, I work on cases with students where there may be a challenge with emotional regulation. And we're investing a lot of money in supervision for when the child needs support. But what if we repurpose that time and even that staff to empower them to be more of teaching emotional regulation skills in addition to supervision, right? Because then you can fade supervision over time. But if you haven't done the skill development, that resource is committed long term. And so I do think there's some real intentional work we can do to build independence and build skills, and ultimately save some funds. But it's more focused on what kids need and what's happening now.
Good questions.
One question. On the Act 173, I think you said it came into effect in 2021?
The funding model, the act has been enacted, but the funding change happens in 2021,
So underperforming grade students, are they supported now?
Under supporting.
Are they being supported with additional extra work?
The students who are struggling?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're being supported, but we don't have the same
What?
flexibility to do
Because
that.
I haven't seen those numbers move for a long time, what is the test criteria? What tests do you use to make that determination that they're underperforming? And is it subject to change year after year?
Well, we have a local assessment plan that has a variety of assessments that we use in the area of literacy and math. And so that's part of the work that PLCs do, is they look at that local assessment data to determine which students need extra support. There's also the SBAC, that's sort of a broad indicator that everybody has, and that's public information in terms of how schools are performing. But I would say our teachers rely more on the local assessment data that we collect throughout the year, at least 3 times a year. And so I have a child in the district, I just had a parent-teacher conference, and that's one of the things they reviewed with me, is how my children did on that local assessment data. So our hope is that, and I do believe that schools have structures in place to look at that data and identify who needs additional support.
Okay.
Yeah. And I want to just go back, because your question was good too around staffing. One of the DMG recommendations too was, when you have attrition, or when you have people leave for a variety of reasons, that's also a good time to think about how can we reinvest those funds. And so we do have turnover as well. And so it's like, well, you know what, we've lost 3 people here, but we really need a BCBA, like a board certified. Let's hire that instead of replacing these 3 positions that maybe don't have the same level of expertise. So I think if we can systemically do that over a few years too, you don't destroy a culture, but you reinvest in a different way. So.
Other questions? I expect this is a subject we revisit often
Yeah.
over the coming months and years. That was a helpful summary of the purpose of the act, and the financial pieces could be challenging.
Yeah.
It's good to know that up front.
Right. Thanks for having me.
I think Brendan had his hand up for another.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, no.
Jeff,
Oh, were you?
Just 4 more questions.
Just giving him a hard time.
Last time I donated to GP.
Hey, don't take it up.
Thank you, Dylan. That was excellent. Very good.
Thanks, Jen.
Okay, next item on the agenda is an update on the status of transportation.
So I'm providing the report in Beth's absence on the update of the implementation. It's in the format that we've been following for the last few board meetings: wins, action items, challenges,
One page?
threats, and then as well as other information. What I'm going to do is provide some highlights, not necessarily go through every piece, but hopefully I'll hit some of the areas that are of most interest, and we can run through it and get your questions afterwards. So I think one thing that's really positive is that we've hired and trained and now implemented and put into place a bus monitor. So this is a person that works on the buses each morning and afternoon, and it's a person that can help with onboard student management. And they're deployed where we have hotspots or where we want to create norms. And it's a new resource. You may recall that we had talked with the board before about trying to get staff. We had created a special wage rate for people that did this. We were paying time and a half to anybody that would be a bus monitor. And we were having difficulty recruiting because of some of the timing and the work that they had between the bells. So it's good to start that off, and then we're evaluating its usefulness, and some of that data will go into next year's budget. We've met with the Westford transportation vendor, the road foreman, and the principal. With the transportation manager, and also this time of year, we just did a reset on our school closing procedures. And so we have some new relationships, new people at Westford, and just working that system out. To date, the district has generated 23 applicants for mountain transit through the EWSD Facebook page. That's the Ben Dickey effort of 23 applicants. And we met with the chair of the Essex Junction Bike Walk Advisory Committee to start to coordinate our efforts. So this is part of the effort to have Jamie not only as a transportation manager, but also having an eye on safe routes to school. and it will help with our advocacy to municipal bodies as well. Under action items, we're building and refining routes for Hiawatha, Fleming, Summit, and ADL. Those routes are going out this week to be shared with principals, our contractors, and the Department of Public Works for both the town, or for the junction, so that we can get that feedback. Working to process the survey responses that we've received, and I think I talk about what those numbers look like later in the update. We're planning the design work and continue to try to get a construction of a shelter on Educational Drive before too much of the winter visits us. We have under challenges, one of our trainees that was going through the process near the completion has had an injury, and their timeline is delayed some. And then I put this together. You will determine whether this makes sense or not, but it tries to walk through the idea that we started off with the need of 24 drivers to fully service Essex Town and Essex Junction. We ended FY18 school year with 15 drivers. Over the course of the summer, we lost 3 drivers. We had retirements and a change of employment. So going into FY19, we had 12 drivers. We picked up 2 drivers over the summer. Mountain Transit actually coaxed 2 drivers out of retirement. And we converted the site supervisor to a full-time driver, as well as hired 3 more drivers to get us up to 18. And that was sort of the day before school. We had the 18 drivers. Since the beginning of FY19, we've lost 5 drivers. Moving out of district, terminations, and the retirees rejoining the retiree ranks. Since the beginning of the year, we've hired and put on routes 5 drivers. So as of November 1st, we have 18 drivers. In the pipeline, there are 6 in testing and license. All are working through and progressing towards final licensing. That pipeline continues to, I think we've strengthened that pipeline because most of them are working as additional bus aides or are receiving some income while they're going through that licensing and training. So that math, 18 plus 6, brings us to the 24, which is what we'll be executing to get the Essex Junction and Essex Town. So since the end of FY18, we've had an attrition of 8 drivers, or about 53% of our staffing has left us, and we're total hired or hiring since FY18 ended is 14 drivers, or approximately doubling our staff. So that's a driver update. Threats, we continue to have the same 2 threats, I think, out here, but they're not to be minimized. We're continued to be sharing a bus with Colchester. It's working out great to provide us an extra bus and an extra driver, but we now don't control that 100%. And we're still self-performing transportation for 2 ADL students that are our choice students from North Hero to ours, but because we don't control the bus solely any longer, we can't put them on the high school bus. The timing doesn't work out. So we're self-performing that transportation. Under other information, we give you some, after we did the changes of the routes and the publicity of the routes, we redid a driver ridership process. So we're roughly transporting about 590 students a day. Our participation for EES is about 50% of students are riding. Founders, about 55%. For EMS, that goes down to 35%. And for high school, so this is high school outside of Village, we're getting 14% ridership. Overall, it's just under 40% ridership. Anecdotally, that's matching what the drivers that have been long-term drivers in Essex have seen in the past, and matches what some of the other districts. We could expect to have seen higher in the younger ages, but the older ages just don't have very high percentage of ridership. For GMP, we still are waiting for the October, but providing the August and September. August was just 3 school days, September was 19 school days. I think the September numbers are So these are trips. You could divide the trips by 2 to simulate a student going to and from, but of course, we're not sure how many students are necessarily always going to and from. But we've had, in that September time period for 19 school days, 271 trips using the route number 2 from Green Mountain Transit, which is the one that comes through the fort and down Route 15. And then the number 4 route had 1,247 trips in that course of those 19 school days. On the survey responses that we sent out to all the families, the survey did go out to 1,030 families, which are all the families for those schools. There are some that are within the walking zone. That idea didn't fully take on, so we have some survey results from people that are in walking zones and vice versa. But all in all, we got 280 responses so far, and 55 are complete opt-outs. So that's about 1 in 5 in the responses are complete opt-outs, will not ride at all. 33 alternate drop-off or pickup locations were requested. And then the remainder of the responses are ride all or on certain days or portion of days. In reviewing the survey, I shared this with the transportation, we're seeing some data that's different from what we've seen in the other places where we've transported longer, that there is, there's more interest in rides to school than rides home from school. And that just may be a process in which that's the culture and that's how the survey was responded. But nearly 45% were reporting that they wouldn't need a ride home on a bus.
Okay, questions, Andre?
With the bus for transportation, is there confidence that that's going to continue for the near future, years to come? Because if it should not continue, then the drivers will be added to what is needed, correct?
Yeah, I think so. I think near term and long term is the question for Westford. It's, you know, it is a small company. 2 of the owners, the principals, are drivers.
Right.
So if there was a decision to change or not continue, that would certainly take 2 drivers out and have us in a position of trying to find additional drivers and additional company to do it. So
Right.
we met with them just recently. They're gung ho. They love this. They do it for Westford. They know that area better than anyone that possibly could know it. So
All right. And the renewal is out for a couple more years, 3 years?
no, it would be coming up for renewal. The company is interested in seeing a renewal go out because
Okay.
there's some,
Good.
you know, they have some costs that they feel, you know, isn't necessarily fully reflected in it. So it would be one of our bids that we'd be looking out to do later in the spring or winter, I guess.
Thanks.
Brendan?
Brian, the churn on the driver piece is pretty challenging. And last time, I think it was last meeting or maybe the meeting before, you provided a total guesstimate not to be held to, that based on where we were either 2 weeks ago or I think it was 2 weeks ago, you thought that there was a chance that we might be able to introduce busing into the junction around December. Do you still feel like that's a time frame that is feasible based on the current information?
I think it's a time frame that's feasible on the driver's side. As we get into December and we know that, you know, just how do we want to roll out transportation and start to do it with the idea of Christmas break and
Right.
and so forth. So it's just, I'm not hedging to a great extent. It's just a matter of, like, if we're starting to get close to Christmas break,
Right.
do we begin to create a routine, have that routine stop and
Right.
redo it? Probably.
Or do we introduce it at the beginning, in the new year?
Yeah, so, I mean, there's not too many months in which we have that kind of extended time off.
Right.
And so it just creates a different situation. But as soon as possible is.
But nothing you're seeing at the moment would cause you to say, oh no, we're looking at April or May now?
No,
Yeah.
nothing that I'm seeing. And the churn is catching our company, our vendor off, that they were having employees that were coming to them and working for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And that group, more of them are beginning to retire. We're seeing that we're having turnover with people that have 1, 2, 3 years of driving, and they're moving to someplace else or moving out of the area. So I think this is what we've talked about, that we're losing some of that stability that's been in a pretty volatile labor market
Right.
by people, and this is exactly what we're seeing in crossing guards as well. We're seeing people that would sign up to be a crossing guard and would be a crossing guard for 15 years.
Right.
And now we're seeing people that are leaving us after a month, leaving us after a year, leaving us after a shorter period of time. Just more churn.
Kim?
I was thinking about the Westford bus company and situation, and I know that they are picking up some Essex town students along the route. So I guess as I think about the holistic plan for transportation, with tremendous appreciation for the company in Westford and their willingness to continue to provide the service and to drivers, I'm hopeful that it is a holistic approach as we look at routing for, so I don't think any of us were aware of sort of those boundaries that seem to have existed. It just seemed as though we had what we needed in terms of current companies continuing their work and covering a year ago when we were talking about it. And then we were briefly up against some real challenges, not being able to use buses for certain things because they were sort of allotted to a town. And I guess as we think about everything, it's in the vein of busing everybody.
Certainly.
Yeah, I had that concern as well about the drivers and the buses. Has the administration considered, well, 2 questions. One, purchasing additional buses and hiring drivers with the school benefits offered as a buffer plan for the next year?
I mean, what we're looking at right now as we're in this process of budgeting and also transportation is there's still some belief as we look at it that self-performing special ed transportation, which is one of the areas that we're currently providing and managing self-performing special ed transportation for junction students, that's the place that we could expand because it gives us, it's some of the most costly transportation.
Yeah,
Not just the busing, but also the one-offs.
right.
And that if we were self-performing that we would be able to have the same cost going into the system, but get an exponential amount of opportunity out of it.
Flexibility.
Yeah, flexibility and daytime transportation. You know, special ed transportation happens throughout the entire day, just like.
I support that, because I think that's the key to this, is we have to have that flexibility and that reserve capacity that's there when needed. And if it means an expense or something we need to consider in budget, you know, I'll support that.
There's gonna be some that, there'll probably be some that even some of the districts that are fully self-performing still find that something like our island run that goes and starts in Isle Lamont and works its way down, that our contractor can charge us a price because they have a park out and ride out situation. So there's a person that actually lives up there and has the bus, and so they drive in. And that's a whole different equation than if somebody was coming to the bus barn here on Founders, driving up to Isle Lamont and then driving back, and then you run into situations in which you have overtime or needing 2 employees or having some scenario like
Do
that.
we have any visibility as to island K-8 students and bus capacity that might be needed to support a request of that need?
Like, what are we seeing for ridership in the islands, and what's that meaning for
Okay.
capacity?
Yeah, for K-8.
Well, we know that middle school is changing for Grand Isle, so that they'll no longer be a middle school at Grand Isle.
Okay,
It's just 7 and 8.
Yeah.
7 to 8,
So
okay.
7 and 8 is, this will be the last year of 7 and 8.
Here's my last question on this. Would it be to our advantage to try the recruiting with professional recruiters? To issue a contract for them to secure? And
Yeah.
also, it would help, my sense is that it might help identify what the cost might be to attract those drivers, but to get some outside the box kind of
Yeah.
approach.
Well, just anecdotally, I was speaking to my counterpart in South Burlington, and they've had a vacancy for a driver since last June
Right,
that they haven't filled yet.
wow.
So we're on the edge of hiring 14. We've generated 23 applicants. Our work is not something that, this is, what we're doing is not something that is, we're getting a lot of success.
Okay. We have enough applicant success.
Yeah, it's holding them on for, just imagine yourself going for a job and that you don't start getting paid until you go through 65 hours of training and go through these testing
I'm trying to
processes.
understand what the incentives are to keep them.
Yeah. Well, I think, the districts that are self-performing seem to, up to now, seem to have been able to avoid some of the volatility, but not completely. I mean, all the districts get pretty tenuous when you have we've had situations where people just, they don't give us their notice, they just don't show up, they don't come. And it's nice to have a company that has hundreds of bus drivers, because they can pull somebody in off of a charter run who doesn't want to be doing that, but you have somebody that's qualified to do it. If we turn that back into the school district, we can't take just anybody to
Right.
try to fill that in. That's not like substituting a classroom.
Okay, thank you.
Unfortunately, that behavior of just not showing up is becoming more and more typical in the job market in general. I'm on the board of a summer camp, and we hired nurses, and some of them just didn't show up. And when you contact them, they'd say, "Oh, I got another job."
Right.
Yeah. Grace.
I know like a while back, like we were talking about like winter and like when that's coming, like sometimes people don't have access to like sidewalks to get to the bus stops, and like sometimes the snowplows aren't like the right dimensions. So I was wondering, like, is there any like progress on that maybe, or like something to adjust that because winter's coming kind of soon?
Yeah. So we're working close. The snow operations plan for both the junction and the town are out there posted. They're aware of our bus stops. We've worked with or have had some conversations. Obviously, Green Mountain Transit has noticed 1,200 additional rides on number 4, so they're aware of their snow clearing area. I anticipate it's gonna be difficult. I mean, there's some people that are at a congregated stop and that's all their neighborhood's ever had. There's some people that are brand new to it. Some are closer, some are further, and we're gonna have those days when it's really bad and we're getting a whole lot of snow. Those are days that we close school, but there'll be days in which there's some snow on the ground, and we've had them before, and we're gonna try to do our best. And
Yeah.
there isn't anything that the town isn't in a position of that they've hired or bought new plows or new trucks or something like that. They're aware of where our congregated stops are and trying to prioritize their snow clearing around those. And they also know when those timings are for all the stops. The same with the junction. And I mean, many people will say the junction's they plow their sidewalks and so forth. There's plenty of people in the junction that aren't satisfied with the level of plowing or the fullness of it or the timing of it. So, this will end up tapping into that vein of sort of dissatisfaction of snow clearing
Right,
on our roads, our sidewalks.
right.
Okay. Kim?
positive, to what extent neighborhoods have a leader or a association, but I'm wondering if the town and village might know of neighborhood association boards or whatever, where we, as a district, can make direct outreach with either a message to be shared with their neighborhoods. I know some neighborhoods require, as part of their covenants, that you clear your own sidewalk.
Yeah.
And I think we would want to explore every possible option in that sort of outreach.
Yeah, we spoke about that the last time we were with all the town, Department of Public Works, and with the town and village unified manager and the police chief. We talked about those covenants and whether they were there. We're meeting again soon. They were gonna look at, a lot of those covenants have to be filed, or they at least went through planning, so that they exist and the planned unit development paperwork is around. It's enforcement.
Yeah, and I just think even if that is an avenue for communication, neighborhood, Facebook pages or whatever they are, if we can, even if it's not part of the requirements, letting all these neighborhoods where there are associations, whether or not it's part of their rules, know that there will be students on congregated stops this year, and be cautious and neighborly
Yeah.
in providing whatever support.
And
you
this,
can.
again, I just want to stress, while we may have more, and certainly some are having a different experience, there's just no sense that we were never door to door with every single pupil. So we were never at that as a norm. So we have congregated stops, we may have more, and again, they may be for different people. So that's the part that is gonna be hard for us to get used to.
Friendly reminder.
Right. Okay, I'd love to move on to the policy discussion, so,
One last question, Martha,
yeah.
real quick. The hired and trained bus monitor, is that a singular person?
Right now, yes.
Are they going to every school and every bus to monitor what's going on? How's that working?
They physically ride a bus in the morning and they physically ride a bus in the afternoon.
Yeah.
We've had, why we track any behavioral instances both at the driver level and at the school level. And if we have hotspots or we're trying to bring something in, we just went in and seating assignments have just been doled out, and we're trying to norm that out, and also responsive classroom within the buses. So it provides another person who isn't obligated to focus on driving,
Right.
to try to create a relationship with students and try to create that
So if we
behavior.
have an issue, is there like a schedule that you're hitting certain areas, or is there somebody
If-
we should reach out to?
Yeah, if you have an issue, definitely reach out to Jamie Smith. And because if you contact him and you're the second or third person, it creates the hotspot. If we don't hear from anyone, then some of it, sort of, we wait until it's been missed and too late, so.
Okay,
Yeah.
great, thank you.
Jamie Smith, yep.
Okay. Todd,
Sure, I was just wondering, am I reading the survey responses in the village correctly, that out of the responses, 80% of the people would like some amount of bus service?
Yeah, I would think it's probably even higher, but if that's the math, yeah, I mean, 1 in 5, so yeah, 4 out of 5, yeah. I mean, I would think that that keeps in contrast that we had about that response in the other schools. What we see as ridership may differ, but we're definitely seeing a high.
The demand's there.
Yeah, and I'm sure that, we probably should work in trying to get a better response rate than the 280 as well. So different mechanisms to do that.
okay, I'd love to, yes.
Sorry, my name is Claire Gilligan. I live off from Tanglewood Drive. I had to go run and grab my kids from Boy Scouts. So I wanted to inquire about the bus stop locations, which have been a significant source of stress in my neighborhood. So I'm representing the other 5 families on my street. I live on Rosewood Trail, and currently we do not have a bus stop, which in my mind is not logical, because for years we've always had a bus stop at the end of Rosewood. Instead, we now have to cross the street, which is a little bit ways up, and idle our cars on a neighboring street, which certainly annoys them. They've asked us to move. We have no other place to park. And so I'm wondering if it is at all feasible to have our bus stop back at Rosewood, because the bus has to go all the way down Tanglewood, turn around, and it goes right by our street anyway. This has been an issue that we brought up with transportation. They have not responded to us, and I figured if I come to a board meeting, maybe something would get done.
So, Brian, you'll take that to Jamie?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so Rosewood Trail is a stop we would like to have back on. We have 90% of the kids on Cindy Lane, which is where our bus stop is now allocated, are all Rosewood Trail children. There have been no, since I've been going there in the morning, there have been no children from Cindy Lane on that street.
Okay,
It's just-
thanks
thank
for
you.
bringing that to Brian's attention.
Good point.
Okay, now, anything else from the audience? I'm sorry, I haven't been very good about that. Okay, then let's move on to the first reading of a transportation policy. Brent.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
So, I am here tonight representing the work of the Transportation Subcommittee, which included Al, Patrick, Healy, with support from Brian, Jamie, Beth, and Chris Leopold. So what we are bringing to you tonight is a first reading of a brand new transportation policy, which you all received last night via email. Before we get into a discussion, I wanted to just point out some of the things that we believe we've achieved in this new policy. And I would encourage the members of the Transportation Subcommittee to also chime in and add your thoughts in just a second. So, as we go through the policy, some of the things that we have tried to accomplish are clarity around what types of...
Do we have extra copies for the audience members?
I didn't bring extra copies with me.
I can take,
That's what I was asking.
Here, take my copy.
Did everybody on the board get a chance to look at the policy before tonight's meeting?
yes.
Okay.
So, just to summarize what I think we've achieved in this new policy is we've clarified the types of transportation that are provided, covering everything from special education, general student transportation, tuition students, as well as transportation for extracurricular activities, sports, field trips, and after-school programs. We also clarified our oversight from a financial standpoint, so you'll see some language in the policy where the board has an opportunity to review some of the financial commitments that we have, contracts and the like around transportation. The policy requires an annual report to the board from the superintendent on the performance of the transportation system, in addition to the regular report that happens through the annual report about ridership.
That's required by law.
That's required by law. We incorporated wellness options, so we talk about walking and biking, as well as the utilization of the public transit option. We also, in detail, on page 2, get into some but not all of the specific conditions that need to be considered in selecting routes and stops. We also have some new language in this policy about student expectations with regard to behavior and a reference to our disciplinary procedures. The policy requires that the district communicate bus schedule information to families in August. That's new, I believe. And one of the bigger changes or biggest changes in this policy is that the policy requires that the superintendent develop contingency plans in the event of insufficient resources, drivers and buses, for example, that prioritizes service to students based on their age or their grade level. Their grade level, starting with kindergarten and then moving up in terms of the grade level. So that might be something we want to focus on as a discussion point as a group. And we also require that any changes to routes and times must be communicated at least 3 days in advance. So that's a highlight of some of the bigger elements of the new policy, but I also want to give the members of the Transportation Committee a chance to weigh in on other reflections or thoughts. Caitlin?
I think some of you may be surprised by how this thing ballooned compared to our prior policy, which is what we were starting from. The prior policy was the VSBA model policy with very, very few adjustments to it. And we felt that it was the feeling of the board that that wasn't providing sufficient guidance for what we wanted happening with transportation. For the most part, what we've added is stuff discussing our vision and expectations that endeavors not to prescribe too many details. So there are a couple of places where we have details, and just to kind of give context on why those are there. One example would be setting that all the contracts should come to the board. That language was there before, and we weren't seeing contracts, leases, and purchases.
Right.
But so that we don't get into a situation where they have to buy some wrenches and they bring a $10 receipt from the hardware store to the board, we put in a limit. This limit happens to be what is supposed to be RFP process in Vermont statutes. So we just figured that that was a reasonable number. Small purchases won't have to come to the board, but we did want this actually to be observed, but not to a ridiculous level. So that's why we added a detail there. Another place that was prescriptive is, and Brendan has already mentioned, we were looking for explicit communication to the community about what they should expect if we don't have enough resources to provide the intended level of service. We had discussed whether we should give guidance on how to prioritize. It was the feeling of Chris Leopold on the phone that the youngest students are the ones who are likely to have the most difficulty accessing school without transportation, and that therefore it made sense to put that prioritization of the youngest students into the policy.
And it's also,
So that came from Chris Leopold.
and it's also where we see the highest level of ridership is in the younger grades as well.
We did inquire that as well. He was explicit that it should be included in policy and not as a separate procedure or a recommendation, which is why it's detailed out.
Right,
Yeah, in policy.
right. I think,
So,
go
yeah,
ahead.
go ahead.
I think one of the key things in terms of differences has to, even though we haven't mentioned it before, has to do with the students making their way to that stop, and that they're escorted by, in some cases, by an adult or a sibling of appropriate age to the stop. But when the bus returns to the same place later in the day, it's really important that an adult or that sibling be there. The consequences, we really haven't, I haven't seen anywhere in the literature, and I think we've got some publicity work to do about what the ground rules are for the school, for the parents, the various responsibilities, and we've got some.
Didn't end up in the policy.
Yeah.
Right, so the other thing I should mention is that there were a number of items, maybe 3 to 5 items, that we were discussing just last night, that we may provide to the administration from the subcommittee that we see as recommendations around things like what Al's referencing and other implementation issues. So not directives, but just based on the work that we've done and the conversations we've had, some recommendations that we would make to the administration on how to implement the policy. But those will be guidance only and not baked in policy.
We do have some excellent examples of the policies, not necessarily policies, but how the interaction with the public can be done in a very sensitive way. And I have 4 links that I've done research on in Fairfax, Virginia, Rochester, New York, Philadelphia, and one out in Illinois. And they're very good examples of how the public is brought on board. Hope to, we'll be sharing those at before our next meeting, and then we can go from there.
So unless there are other comments by the members of the committee, I think we can open it up to questions.
I have 2 questions. So the first is, you're still going to be meeting as a committee and going through those recommendations?
So yeah, I'm guessing that we may need one more meeting to respond to whatever feedback we get from the board this evening. If the board feels that adjustments need to be made to this draft policy, we'll have to reconvene to consider those. And I think we'll also want to sort of finalize those recommendations as well. So I anticipate that we'll meet one more time as a subcommittee.
Okay, and I think in your policy, can we go back to the beginning page? Okay, because I gave my copy over there, so just scroll, if you would scroll for me, there was a piece of it, I guess it's the second page.
If you say what you're looking for, I can probably tell you where to find it.
Well, there was a list of
Yeah, page 2.
conditions.
Yeah.
Right there.
That right
Right
there,
there.
Yeah.
I was very pleased to see that,
Okay.
because I think you've put safety. I think what you've got is all your safeties that we've heard from parents, and then the age and maturity of students transported, of course, which had to be at the bottom, because we gotta do this, the safety and physical pieces first.
This is not prioritized.
Correct,
Right.
but,
I just want to be sure that's clear.
no, but the way I take it, there's all your safety, and then certain age group kids would be considered for
And
safety.
the reason why we also have that non-exclusive phrase in there is because we also know that we're not gonna be able to capture all the potential issues, but we hope to provide enough that it gives the administration at least the sense of what we're thinking in terms of issues around safety, condition, infrastructure, and physical condition of the stops and such. So,
Right, there's other things that I'm sure the administration
Right.
considers, like not having congregated stops in front of a cigar store or something, like.
right.
Yeah.
Wait a minute.
That's not on the list, but.
Candy store.
Equal
So
opportunity
has
here.
the policy gone before Beth and Brian?
Yeah, so last night, actually, last night was, we had our last meeting was last night, where we had Beth, Brian, and Chris Leopold all provided us with detailed feedback, and we had a 2-hour discussion that resulted in this final policy draft.
Oh, okay, I just wanted to,
So it's been reviewed by administration and by legal.
okay.
Other questions or comments? Andre?
I think it is well crafted and seems to touch upon a lot of areas that really weren't present in the previous policy, and I think this has really pulled a lot of issues together and crafted in and addressing a lot of things that were not necessarily being discussed.
Right.
And I think, like, kudos.
Could I mention just one other sensitive area that, in the ratings that, the research that I did independently, a number of districts have taken a position that specific homes and addresses and names shouldn't be out in the public domain. And that was sort of a privacy issue. I'm not sure if there's any Vermont law that's associated with that, but it's something that we probably ought to give some thought to. And I pass that along just for what it's worth.
Are you thinking we put things in the public domain?
I don't know.
There was some concern about whether or not we should publish the specific routes and stops in the paper, for example, or whether it's communicated in a
Right.
smaller, more tightly knit way. with families.
It seems to work to communicate it in that tightly knit way,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
seems preferable.
It does, but there's a privacy side too, so it's just a balance.
Okay. Andre?
I guess my concern with that is if you're gonna tighten the communication level, you have to ensure that all users have access to whatever vehicle,
Right,
because not everyone has internet, et cetera.
right.
So you'll have to ensure communication to all and not exclusive by default necessarily.
Correct.
But we already have to be able to do that as a school district, right?
I understand, but
So I think you did a great job. I have 3 things. One, the last sentence, I think right next to the last,
To the end, the very end.
yeah. This next to the last, that sentence is already contained in the first paragraph, so
That was
it's
supposed to come out.
redundant
Error from last
and
night.
I thought
I
it,
think it should be taken out.
I thought we took it out.
It's up, it's
Yep,
above. I just don't know. It doesn't-
We did a
I
lot
don't know
of
if it
copy
matters
pasting.
where you
yep,
want
you're
it.
right, you're right, that can be deleted.
Brian is valiant. Copy pasting.
It was late.
The second thing is when you talk about contingency plan, would you envision a contingency plan where you had enough drivers to transport all of K through 8 and then only enough drivers to do 1 or 2 high school routes? Would you potentially do those routes based on that list? Or would you not transport any high school students? Did you have that discussion?
I think this still leaves a lot of things that are adjustable. We discussed like distance walking to stops is something that is adjustable depending on available service levels. Whether you use some other district's model of rolling outages or partial service or really long routes or don't offer it until you have enough drivers to offer it to the whole set of grade levels are decisions that it would be good to have publicly available. Like our situation, if we don't have enough drivers, we'll extend the routes until they're 90 minutes long, and then we will cut some routes from the oldest students, or we'll have rolling outages, or whatever they're gonna be. When people know that in advance, those decisions will not feel arbitrary, and a smaller percentage of people will be angry.
Yeah, I think,
People will also be able to plan.
Yeah, it's an important.
yeah, I think, Martha, I think the point here is that rather than have the board wade into, determining or defining for the administration exactly what every contingency plan could be, I think what this does is it sets the expectation that the if a plan is required, the administration must come to the board to present that plan, so that we have an opportunity to weigh in, to ask questions, to make suggestions before that is communicated to the community.
Okay. Finally, and I'm pretty sure, because I have communicated this to Beth and Brian, that this was raised with you last night, but I want to bring it up again. And that is your piece about congregate stops and not having the distance to a stop be longer than the walking distance. I think that's gonna add a lot of stops in Westford. And I just wondered if you thought about the cost, if anybody talked to the transportation company about how doable that is. I wondered if it would make more sense to have that section just be for K through 8 and leave the high school out altogether.
We did, we did speak about it, and honestly, I think that the general consensus was that there, just as we've advocated that Essex Junction should not be necessarily excluded because they happen to have sidewalks, that Westford students should not be, exempt from needing to walk only, 1 mile or whatever, just because they live in Westford. So I do think that the thought is that yes, it may add more stops. That's not really for the board to delve into. Speaking with Westford Transportation Company, would expect administration to do that. But I think that equitability across the district is important, and I don't see any reason why a Westford high school student should be forced to try to get 3 miles to the closest stop when we don't expect that from anyone else in the district.
Right.
Um,
I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but we,
No.
there was
Think about how
discussions,
Westford actually works.
Yeah.
Like, we,
I mean, I don't know for certain, but I think they only stop in a couple of places.
the
So,
information,
And those places are farther than a mile from many, many houses.
yeah, the information that we received was that there were 3 congregated high school stops, but that to some degree, high school students could get on a K through 8 bus to get somewhere.
so they could theoretically get on a K-8 bus to get to Westford School, and then from Westford School get a pickup to the high school.
I don't think that's right.
I'm not certain, I wasn't certain that Beth was contemplating that. We were sort of
Okay.
have a group contemplation that
But,
So
I mean,
there isn't even a pickup at the school. It's on the down common.
so, yeah,
And I think the timing isn't, I could be
We-
wrong,
but yeah,
but I
we,
don't think the timing's right.
based on, I mean, like, Al has often discussed the dangerous characteristics of some of the roads in Westford. I know many roads in Westford don't have very high traffic compared to in the town or the junction, but it still seemed like, maybe the solution is establish 2 miles as your walking cutoff for 9 through 12 for all 3 communities, which would basically mean no high school transportation in the junction will ever happen, but it's not particularly dangerous for high school students to get to school in the junction. There's like very few homes where that would be hazardous for a teenager. But then be treating Westford students to the same degree of transportation that we offer to rural Essex town students just kind of makes sense. And we understand that it may not be possible when we're operating 2 different transportation contracts to have everything match up immediately. But the policy should guide future contracts rather than the operation constantly being based on historical contracts.
So I'll tell you what we'll do is, knowing that we're gonna make some adjustments, I think this is one issue that we can dig into a little deeper and maybe, look specifically at the circumstances in Westford, just to see, if this policy is, if we're able to actually meet the requirements of the policy.
But
So-
it might come into recommendations
Right.
more than
Right.
policy.
Exactly.
Like,
Right.
this year, we can budget this way.
It would be
Right.
interesting to know how many more stops would be required.
Right.
And it would be interesting to have some feedback from our present provider.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Kim and Marla.
Just generally, it's a big departure from our policies in the past, just tone and style. And I'm wondering, it was hard to pull out the policy statement from the administrative responsibilities. And I'm wondering if that is something that could happen, so it would be more clear.
Can you give
A
an
good
example?
portion of it is implementation. So on one of our financial reports, we have a policy statement and then administrative responsibilities category. So I don't know that I we have headings that are called things in that we have an introduction and then wellness and something.
The headings were in an effort to, basically, we started with a whole bunch of different statements in no particular order. And I endeavored to categorize them into
Yep.
organization. But if you have suggestions about an organization that would more closely accord with the rest of our policies, I don't think this is particularly far off from some of our more complicated and wordy policies, such as firearms, weapons, voluntary school reassignment, or other ones that weren't written totally by the VSBA.
And if I could, I think that it does also match many of the transportation policies that we reviewed from surrounding districts to the extent of, where we felt it needed some specific clarification. So I don't think it's very far off from what, you might see pulling up Colchester's or CCU's or whatever. I mean, they're very all stylistically or in tone in line with what we see
We
here.
can take another look at whether or not it's organized, especially, I guess I'm especially concerned with whether or not it conforms with some of our other policy formatting, so I can take a look at that.
My question is, because you raised the congregated stops, many, many years ago in the dark ages when I had to ride the school bus, a congregated stop was like, for instance, at a local grocery store where a high school bus picked us up. I mean, you rode the elementary school bus because it was going that way, and they coordinated. That was congregated, so if I missed the stop there, they had to get me to the congregated or to the high school. So I don't know what your definition of congregated is.
It's not door to door.
Not door to door, so,
Right.
when you talk about the safety, I think it's important whether you're in Westford or wherever. I'm not expecting a student to walk in,
Their parents bring them. That's the reality, or the neighbor. Somebody brings them to the congregated stop. But it's a huge improvement for folks in Westford who were having to drive all the way into the junction in the past. So they're fine right now because to them they've got a level of service they've never had. But I also hear the argument about if we're going to try to make things the same, then it should be the same for everyone.
Well, I think that's the challenge, is that we can't make things the same, but we need to provide a certain equity of access.
Level of service.
So things will look different from community
Equitable
to
does not
community.
mean equivalent.
Yeah,
Right.
so.
Kim?
I'm feeling as though I recall it, but I couldn't find it. A policy that spoke to contracting from a finance, and we had a dollar figure beyond which it comes to the board. I couldn't find it in our list of policies, but do we already have that, and would it be better to reference that section by policy?
We do not have a specific policy. I actually asked this question of Martha like a year ago, and Brian gave me the answer. We default to a VSBA rule, I believe.
State statute.
I can go back through my email and forward the specific reply to, but our current policies do not have
Okay.
a specific
Right.
contract amount that we have to approve.
So right now, this would be the
Okay.
only specific
amount.
dollar amount contract that we would.
And all of
Right, to
that
approve.
wording, except the dollar amount, is in the model policy of the VSBA. So the model policy of the VSBA has always created a higher scrutiny on these items, these costs, and so forth.
Right.
But it's defaulted now to the statute, which is, the statute also has a high degree of scrutiny around transportation of students.
Okay, so I guess maybe separate question for another group at another time is, should we have a general policy that speaks to contracting in general? It didn't have policy, but when we did our systems changes and things, we had sort of anything that exceeded a reasonable dollar figure, which I think was 15,000, came before the board just almost as much as anything for our awareness around the bid process and, you know. And then,
This is where it is in the statutes.
okay,
Got that number.
thank you. The timeline, the tuition students, so just so that I understand how this is similar or different, board has never approved whether or not we're transporting tuition students. This policy would require us to approve whether or not we are transporting tuition students. Am I getting that right?
So the existing policy stipulates that the board is to approve the transportation of non-resident students. That's in the existing
current
policy.
policy says that.
Yep.
I don't recall that we did that. I think we saw the numbers and the expense, like the tuition versus the cost. And
So prior to having students, the board did a lot of work with Paul O'Brien to create an RFP and to begin to go out for transportation services. So that was some of the work that happened then. I'm not, this prior to me, so I'm not sure if there was deliberate action by the board or a motion to say it. I think this policy subcommittee has identified that CCSU had a policy on how do you determine when you tuition non-resident students. Would be good to bring that into our procedures.
when you transport the non-resident
Yeah,
students.
like the why.
Yeah.
So that could come into it. I also just want to point out that it wasn't for the lack of trying to have one unified contract.
Right.
And back in 2016-17, the marketplace is not going to bid against
One bidder. Yeah.
the Westford contract.
Yeah.
It would be surprising to see the marketplace bid against that. So, and the idea was to allow, the board decided to break it up and awarded a Westford contract rather than forcing a bid for all three. So,
Right.
you know, it did get parsed up and pieced, and then the Essex Town contract was allowed to not be replaced and just be continued. It was a 5-year contract. So, you know, those were all decisions that,
We made those
Yeah.
decisions.
I'm just trying to think how it happens through making sure that we're understanding how process would apply under the policy. And so, in the situation of our relationship with our current Mountain Transit, we still have a bus that's a tuition bus, right? Or we have collaborated completely on tuition
we have
students.
Georgia, and then we basically
And we
have half
collaborate
of
on
the Highlands.
Highlands bus. And that is all provided through Mountain Transit.
Currently, they're the contractor
And-
for both.
I think that was as surprising as anything, that it's all under Mountain Transit, and that was a separate contract where we had not a lot of flexibility. I'm glad that seemed to have worked out. So I'm just trying to think about if our current situation were put through this lens, have we sort of caught things? I'm sure that's what you guys were thinking about as you were doing it. And have we made clear the parts that are sort of board responsibility and administration responsibility, board providing the guidance, the lens through which you need to make your decisions, and then the reporting loop, which I saw in this policy around reporting out to the board annually. And so the last question I have is the timeline for implementation, because reading this policy, if it goes into effect December, are we no longer transporting high school students because we're transporting K-8 kids? And so that, I think, would be really important to understand. Prospectively, I think those considerations absolutely make sense, but we saw the challenge in disrupting prior transported students of distance at short notice. So,
Right, I mean, my assumption, and I do have to leave in a minute, but I want to just answer that question. The assumption is that when the board approves this policy, we would accompany it with some recommendations for implementation. And it's true that under this new policy, the administration would immediately be required to develop a contingency plan and to report to the board what its plan is, because it will immediately be in the situation of not having sufficient resources. So, that will have to happen. That will be part of what will be required.
Yeah, it would mean that we'd have to change the contingency plan of serving historically served. And it would be based upon grade, and not those other factors. It would be first the priority of grade, so.
And so that, I think, would be a concern mid-year. So I don't, I wouldn't be able to support that version. Prospectively, absolutely. Even in a new school year, with adequate notice, in shortage of resources, that would be fine.
Well, we've been asked to develop a new policy. The board is being asked to consider it and approve it. And then, so once it's put into action and the things that are required now start to happen, the board isn't left out of that. So the administration will have to bring a contingency plan, which the board will have to weigh in on and provide feedback about.
But through the policy lens, because
Yeah.
again, that would be our responsibility, is looking through the policy lens.
Right.
It is saying they have to go by age.
That's right.
So where would our authority be to suggest differently?
Can I speak to
find
that?
appealing.
I think a part of the process of making recommendations about implementation would include a timeline for adequate communication of the change in policy and its implications to the community. Our current policy is not being strictly followed. For instance, we haven't seen any contracts about purchases and leases brought to the board for the maintenance of the transportation system, which that language is in the current policy.
We did when we
Yeah.
accepted the
They
contract.
haven't been,
But we haven't seen every purchase, which is what our current policy technically says. So I think that we probably have the leeway to say, we need to spend a month communicating this, or we need to spend 3 weeks communicating this, or here's a suggested set of procedures to accompany this. You have 2 weeks to edit them and bring them to the board, and then the policy will come into effect. I mean, that would seem to be part of the process of recommendations around
so
implementation.
is that, I guess I was working under just the wrong assumption that, that this would be to move into the next school year, but everyone sees this to be, upon second reading, it is the policy of record. Is that what the committee's intention was?
No, I mean, my thought process is that we're gonna continue to operate as we've been operating, because an instant disruption in the this implementation phase is probably going to continue us working to get K through 5 in the junction, as we've asked, but going forward after this year, that this is the policy as it is. I don't see us voting this in December, and then on, Wednesday, Brian coming to us with a plan that says, okay, high school is eliminated, 8th grade is eliminated, and, now we can do K through 7 everywhere else. My impression is that this will be true.
Yep.
Into the new year, and that the implementation process that we do and work with as a board is going to,
Yeah.
help cover or facilitate the transition.
So
But-
that begs the question, should we be approving this policy in this particular year? I'm gonna let Kim, and then I'll get to you. Kim?
I'm wondering if we might not put a July 1 effective date, with this being reference for decisions made in the interim. I mean, that.
You're
that
suggesting a July 1?
A July 1, like that effective July 1. So
Right.
we could put the first reading, second reading, and effective date.
Yeah.
Or putting a policy into place that is so prescriptive about how the contingency plan will be written up, and disrupting what was intended to be the plan that's been being worked toward, would seem, if we thought we were hearing it in August and September, if we were to go back to disrupting everything, I'm guessing we would have people disrupted across an entire spectrum. So that would mean we've got 2 buses in Westford transporting Westford kids that would no longer being transported and may or may not be interested in picking up Junction kids. So I just don't even see how our current contracts accommodate a change of that nature right now. And I would support a July 1 implementation.
Todd, you're gonna finish with the board before.
Yeah, I was just gonna suggest an effective date that you're very familiar with.
Okay. Keely.
So I'm comfortable with the idea of an effective date. I'm not comfortable with the idea of not adopting a policy after we've put all this work into the policy. However, I would caution that while it feels like we're continuing to make progress towards the plan the way we've been doing it, it seems to me, looking at the numbers, equally likely to us transporting the Junction in December, that we would find ourselves 2 or 3 drivers short of being able to transport the high school in December, just based on the churn. And when we lose 2 drivers, if that happens, do we keep plowing more and more drivers into the high school? Or do we recognize we've developed a policy that would guide us to direct our resources in a different way? So we've already disrupted the high school. We've been talking about this implementation for 2 months or whatever, and we're gonna direct those drivers differently. I think this is a good discussion for us to have about what the implementation process looks like. And I think we need all that input in order to make recommendations as a subcommittee, but I think it's entirely, completely possible that the high school will be disrupted even without us trying to transport all the kindergartners. And we should be aware of that fact while we're making these decisions.
Yeah, I mean, as it is right now, we are not arbitrarily, but to probably minimize the amount of disruption that was caused because of our inability to provide it as of August, that we're serving historically served communities. And that's just what the plan has been, and we've been trying to add it, and there's nothing in our policy that says that that was how we had to do it, or that was how it should have been done. It just seemed like, that was, I don't even know if fair is the word, but it was, we were in emergency mode, and that's how we made the decision. That's
Well,
how
it was also, it was also the first contingency plan when we came in August 1st, the year before, that was that we would serve the historically served. We didn't at that time say, let's come up with a contingency plan that doesn't serve the historically served. So there was some consistency, and that consistency goes back to that the Essex Town School Board had determined that it was reasonable and necessary to provide transportation, which is the statute. That boards are to look at reasonable and necessary for access to the education. And the Prudential Committee had looked at reasonable and necessary over the course of decades and generations, as Essex Town had, and had decided it wasn't. So, there is that historical bent. We didn't expand. So, there's times which there's this belief that there's just been no forethought or work to keep us transporting, and I think there's been some forethought in trying to provide this. I know that there's some deep disappointment that we're not there yet, but that deep disappointment can't just erase really 2.5 years of this board trying to do it, and for a good portion of time prior to any of the administration that you currently work with being on board.
So Kim, are you suggesting that we need to have that conversation tonight? Or do you think we can have that conversation at our next board meeting after your committee has met and there's a chance we're going to move that board meeting to the following week?
I think Brendan would be the right person to speak authoritatively to that. But my feeling would be if we're adopting this policy with a effective date, there's nothing to prevent us being guided by it and moving toward it as our recommendations for the interim period. Because our current policy doesn't restrict us from doing anything in this policy.
Right.
It simply doesn't give a lot of guidance. So I would be comfortable with that conversation occurring after our next meeting, or at, like, you're all welcome to attend transportation subcommittee meetings. They're loads of fun, and Brendan actually usually keeps them very time limited, but I don't think that we have to have that conversation tonight.
Okay, but I hear that we are recommending, if we're going to approve this at first reading tonight, I believe we are recommending an effective date be added to the policy. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes.
Okay.
Just a process question, because I really don't remember how this goes. Approve for first reading doesn't mean we're approving this version necessarily of the policy, but we're saying we're accepting that a first reading has happened?
Yeah,
Help
it's
me
not,
understand.
it's not an action item.
Okay,
So
so
it's
we're not
actually
doing anything.
the agenda
Okay,
topic
thank
is
you.
first reading.
Okay.
That's
So it's
we
really a
would need to
chance.
put that in there.
Thank you for that
Yeah.
reminder.
And presumably
It's
it gives the
different from
public
how we used
the next 10 or however, whenever the next meeting is scheduled, it also gives time for that to be out there.
Yeah.
So the committee, the administration, the board may get feedback that's really on point and would be incorporated. There has been plenty of times when second reading has been postponed.
Yeah.
And for more work to go into it. I mean, that's happened before, certainly in the bullying and harassment situation where there was an evolving state law at the same time we were trying to do policy to catch up to state law.
Weapons and
So then-
firearms had to
yeah.
go back.
And second reading, it's not always second reading and adoption even, right? It is warned as a potential action item, but adoption could be yet a third occasion.
Absolutely.
Okay, I
Board
just
could table it, they could choose not to take
bad
action
at
on it.
Robert's
But
rules,
if
so thank
approve
you.
second reading, that is adoption.
So you can approve at second reading, but it's not required that you approve at second reading.
Of course not.
Okay, thank you.
What you would be doing would be postponing second reading if you didn't feel it was read.
Well, you would have, I mean, it would be read. I'm probably getting the words wrong there, but we
Gotta
would not be
reschedule
taking an
the
action
second
item on it or whatever, we table it or something,
Right.
whatever. That's okay, I just wanted to make sure I
You wouldn't
understood.
take action. Right.
So bad at
Martha, for the
Robert's rules.
board's information, in the discussion last night and also with Chris's guidance and going through this process, it's pretty clear that we need a separate CTE policy for transportation.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a lot of different nuances that would just be confusing, I think, to join it all as one. And this board is the governing body of CTE, so that's work still to be done.
Should that title be different up there then?
Yeah,
Well, that title, I think, is correct in the sense that this is the school, the Center for Technology has that slightly different relationship, but this is the board for,
But we govern that. So I would
we'll ask
be-
Chris that
I
question.
think it
I
might
believe-
confuse people.
I believe we discussed mentioning in this policy that there is a separate CTE policy, if that's how we decided to go.
So that should be added, I think.
yeah,
Right.
or even in, I wonder if in the
The
title,
CTE.
we can say pre-K through, well, I don't know
I
how we
mean, everything
distinguish
that we
it.
say in here
Let's
is
let the
true, because
subcommittee.
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
the
figure it out.
high school
Figure out the
students
word.
who are EHS CTE students, we're
Come
furnishing
that way.
them with
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
transportation, so.
Yeah. So
Oh, yeah.
are you gonna suggest that the transportation subcommittee work on a CTE policy?
That's up to,
Can I ask a question?
I don't know how we want to do
No.
policy necessarily going forward.
This is just, how do we characterize Island's kids who are CTE kids? are we transporting them as CTE kids, or are we transporting them as Essex High School kids? Are they tuition? I just don't know how that goes.
Yeah, it's
Like,
partly
how would
who
they
their
fall?
LEA is. So, I mean, we have 147 students who attend Essex High that also attend the Center for Technology. But then we have students from like Colchester that attend the center, and Colchester transports them.
Transports their own kids.
So, but we,
Island kids who were coming to Essex High School would be our students first,
And
and
so-
CTE students second.
And CTE then sends buses for whom? Who does CTE have transportation
Burlington,
for?
they're currently transporting, and I believe South Burlington, they're currently transporting. And part of that was a matter of logistics to support our own students and their, because in a regional situation where we have two, it depends upon the program, so there's some of that.
Thank you.
Okay, are we ready to move on? Oops,
Thank you, thank you.
Thank
for doing
you.
that.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
so much.
Oh, Todd, sorry.
Sorry. I just want to say a few things, it won't take much time, but I think doing an effective date for a total revised policy for next school year makes sense. But I think in the meantime, the transportation subcommittee should come back with the direction that the administration has been asking for on the current contingency plan. So you're not upsetting the entire apple cart with the new policy, but you're giving them the direction, Keela, as you're speaking about, what happens if we lose some bus drivers, then what? They've been asking for that direction. I think you should.
Yeah, I think that's part of our, I don't know what we're calling it,
Policy.
recommendations
Right,
or,
procedure.
yeah, recommendations on
But-
procedure, yeah.
As a parent, I'd be fine if you make this new policy effective next year, as long as you come back with some direction about what's currently happening.
Yep.
And then on the last page of the policy, paragraph 2, it mentions intended level of transportation services. Nowhere in the policy is it defined or declared what the intended level of service is. So I think it'd be helpful to know what the intended level service is, so you know when you have to kick in the contingency plan.
I think there's a chart.
No, there's a list of criteria with no prioritization, so.
Right, but there is the whole walking distance, that kind of thing.
And that's another
But-
thing, there's no mention of what decides a walking distance.
Right.
Yeah, that's
Um,
specific because, right, that shouldn't be something in policy, that should be,
Well,
Great part of
maybe some
procedure.
criteria, but
It
yeah,
should be
there's.
procedure.
Procedure.
And then the last thing is, it would be really nice to see an explicit statement in the policy, the new policy, that municipal boundaries aren't a factor in the provision of transportation services.
I don't know, I understood that because it's the district,
Well,
the new district.
it's not happening now.
But I think if we pass this policy, then it will be a policy for the whole district. Yeah. It's worth a conversation at the subcommittee level.
It would be
Okay.
nice to see it there. I think it would relieve a lot of residents of the village that just because they live in the village doesn't mean that that's gonna factor into their service.
Second class citizen. Okay.
It looks like Patrick is taking notes, so.
yeah, Brennan just asked me to
Thank you.
get a few, so that when we go to our next meeting, that
Yep.
we'll have
Thank you.
what needs to be addressed.
Okay,
Thank you.
all right, let's see if we can get through the rest of the agenda. Communications task team.
So Voices for Education, I'll start with that. We had a facilitator training on Saturday and we had 18 facilitators trained for the summit that's taking place on December 1st from 8:30 to 12:30, right downstairs in the Essex Middle School cafeteria. The students were phenomenal. We had 5 high school students from Essex High School. We had 2 ADL students and 2 Westford students. and paired with 9 adult community members. And it was a phenomenal day and left us really excited for the upcoming summit, which is called It Takes a Village, Voices for Equity and Belonging, and we hope to see you all there on December 1st.
What was the time again?
8:30 to 12:30, with lunch after, free lunch. And
Who says you
childcare.
can't get a free
And
lunch?
transportation.
Wait, what kind of childcare?
Childcare.
Like, what kind?
Somebody there on site.
Like school age,
School
younger
age.
than school age?
We're looking for high school age.
It's happening here too, so.
No, I'm saying the age of children who can be
Oh,
cared for.
to be worked out. We haven't gotten that far, but usually we have done 12 and under. So I think it would be probably that. Keep,
So they can handle it at a.
Infant.
we can handle it, yeah, and we do, and yeah, newborns maybe might want to say. And the other update is that you might have all noticed that there's a new message to the community from the board that we've been, that is part of our new operations. Keely drafted that last one, and we'll be drafting them moving forward. Thank you, Keely, for that. The board community, the message last month, if you didn't see it, included a transportation update, an update on Act 77 implementation, an update on EHS and CTA start and stop times, and a section that we're calling Promise of the Merger, that we're going to be contributing information about the things that are wins as they were promised to the community.
Where, I'm gonna fess right up here, because I don't, would it be, where was it posted? Like, where do we see it? Did it go like on the, I don't even know.
Ben put them out on Front Porch Forum, but I think the most recent one went jointly with the announcement of this board meeting agenda.
Okay.
So
Right.
you might not have noticed it as
Is
much.
there-
We're
do
still
we
working
wanna-
out the kinks.
We're working on
Timing,
where it's
yeah.
going to live
Yeah.
and what that's going to look
It'd be
like.
kind of
yeah.
cool if it lived on a flag somewhere on the homepage, or like someplace where if you're not getting it through your feeds, but you're going to the website,
Yeah.
it comes.
It should be easy
We're
to find.
working with
Yeah.
Yeah,
We'll work
that'd
with
be
Ben on
awesome.
that.
Thank you.
And speaking of Ben, I just wanted to shout out to Ben, who's just doing a phenomenal job in so many ways, and for the Voices for Education work and the work that we're doing for the summit and for this whole 3-year Nellie Mae grant. We are so lucky to have Ben on. He's been phenomenal.
Yeah. And just the Facebook posts, I just love them.
Yeah.
I know.
They're great. Okay, thank you. I think Transportation Policy Subcommittee has had their time.
No, I want to hear
Time
more.
assigned for tonight.
You can sing the wheels on the bus go round and round.
That'd be perfect.
I hear that song.
Negotiations.
We met last week with the Teachers Association leaders and the Support Staff Association leaders and our team of 3, Beth, Deb, and Chris Leopold, to come to agreement on a common set of ground rules, which we were able to do, which was great. We set dates for our first exchange of proposals and a few dates beyond that. And the process is likely to be as it was last year. And what we hope to be able to do is have all 3 of us present for the initial exchange. And then one of us will be the consistent presence at the table with Beth and Chris and Deb. And we will begin with the teachers about a month or a month and a half ahead of beginning with the support staff. Some of that common language will be able to be sort of vetted and then more easily moved on with support staff, and that has been a process that has worked for us, but we're not taking as many months as we did between beginning on the support staff as we did last time around. We anticipate with less, we've merged the contracts, so I don't want to make any assumptions about anything else, but nothing will be as hard as last year was. The Labor Board sort of provided some guidance around these meetings, and negotiations aren't considered a meeting that needs to be warned, frankly, unless our committee is attending in a quorum. So if a single board member is at the table negotiating with this crew I just described, that meeting is not a warned board meeting in executive session or anything like that, with the guidance of the labor board. But if we are the three of us, or even two of us attending, we will warn that. So we are going to plan to warn the initial meeting as hopefully all three of us being able to be there to understand the proposals. At that initial exchange, we offer them our first proposal, they offer us theirs, and we hear from them on the areas of change and interest, and we provide our rationale for the changes we're requesting. I think it's really important that all three of us be there. While it seems as though I'm going to be the primary person again, I've had the support and help of the rest of our team at times when I've not been able to do that. And so that is our plan. And we just wanted to make sure you understood the process. If at the very end of the process last year, Chris and Deb met with their teacher leaders at the very end for some cleanup to finalize the language, and wanted to make sure you understand that they would be, Beth and Chris would be acting on our behalf if that were to happen. It happened last year. It is not going to be the way we will intend to schedule our meetings, but we were intentional about scheduling that with the final cleanup between our attorney and Deb and their two leaders, not their entire team of four and not our entire team of four. So I just want you to understand the process and know that our intent is that there will always be a board member at the table unless we get to a point where that is not as advisable as just finishing up the last final things.
So is it your intention to share our proposal with the board prior to sharing it at the negotiations table?
I believe Deb had shared the outline of in executive session, I believe.
Just on one piece.
It was the highlights of areas of change, I believe. We did a breakdown, okay.
We need a meeting as a
Okay.
board in executive session.
Okay, then I
Discuss
thought that we
this.
had gone through that where there were a few areas of change, but maybe, did we do that in the executive session or was it? Anyway, we will then. We had some guidance in executive session previously,
We
but
did
I
do
thought,
some,
Yeah.
but that was
I thought we had
before.
highlighted the areas
But
of,
I think that was before the principal said wait, and, clearly there may be
I will
some
double check.
special
I
ed stuff.
know that there was one area that she pointed out to me that changed from the first time that we met in executive session. So I will check in with her, and we are not meeting, I think we're meeting the first week in December, so we can certainly do that in executive session before the next meeting to do the highlights of the areas of change, for sure.
Just a question on your committee and the warning. If there are three of you on the committee and two can't make it, but then they can make it, then they're stopped from being able to go if you haven't warned it.
So
I can see not warning cleanups. I can see that, but I really think you're safer to get
So
it
it's
warned because people's
actually-
schedules change.
So I think it's more a matter of the plan. So we're going to warn the first one because we want all three of us there and whatever contingent we can get there. They have 4 people coming and we negotiated with just one board member at the table. What changed is the labor board came down and said negotiations aren't considered a meeting. So even if we were to warn a committee meeting and I'm the only one who shows up, we would open the meeting and then close the meeting because negotiations is not considered a meeting.
So how do you resolve it if all of a
It's
sudden
not even executive
Andre or
session.
Brendan wants to be there? It's their right to be there.
Well, I
So-
guess, I don't know how, I mean, Martha, I'm not exactly sure how we want to do it. The negotiations,
So I guess I don't understand why you warn it if 3 people are going to be there and not if 1.
because it's not, negotiations themselves, Chris Leopold said, with the more recent opinion of the labor board, was that negotiations are not a meeting. if you have a quorum of a subcommittee present, you need to warn a meeting of the subcommittee, and then you dismiss the meeting and you go into negotiations. And if there is one person present, it's not a quorum of the subcommittee. So he's the one who asked us to explain the process and make sure the board understood the process, and that it would be, in the unlikely event that, as happened only at the very last meeting last time, that we are comfortable empowering Beth and Chris to negotiate, within parameters on our behalf. I certainly can ask him to give us reference or something for me to share at the next meeting, but
No, I'm clear now.
okay.
So what I'm hearing is that the subcommittee has made an agreement that all three of them will attend certain sessions, but aside from that, only one of them will attend. And that person will be Kim, except when she cannot, in which case it could be Andre or Brenda. But the subcommittee has made a decision. Keely.
Wasn't that the normal practice in the
It
last
was.
round, that
Yes.
only one
Absolutely.
member
That's
attended
right.
the negotiations? Because
Yeah.
otherwise,
Except for
the teachers are like, this is
was-
insane, you have too many
Right.
people.
That's right, and the room gets crowded, but because they come with four, and because we've got Chris and Deb and Beth, a board member makes four, so there's been sort of an optics of balancing things. Also, in those, the way it was before this decision by the labor board, we would open the meeting and move it directly into executive session. I would move it into executive session because now negotiations aren't considered a meeting unless we have a quorum of a board subcommittee there. It's just a thing. It's like it's like an administrative meeting or something. But certainly, if there's a time where we know that we are going to be passing a baton. Anytime we've done that, and I've appreciated the occasions Andres had been able to really help me with that, as we were, I think, especially getting through the support staff
Right.
piece of it. There were a handful of occasions that was necessary, and we made sure to communicate clearly where we were in the process. And sometimes we will just have a subcommittee meeting because we need to get back together with Deb when there's changes. Again, I don't want to presume anything about this process, except that there's no way it will be the depth and extent of what we went through last time. And
Right.
so I think we'll have a much better sense from, we tried really hard to get into the contract a language that reflected the values on both sides and the anticipated concerns on both sides. And obviously, there have been real life practice in the last 2 years that are going to probably reflect what each side is looking to implement a little differently. So I was absolutely perfectly willing to have either Andre or Brendan lead if they were interested, and I was also willing to do it, and so I think that's how it became me.
Keely.
I think my question was answered, because I was just wondering how they regroup to find out, like, what's been going on. But
Yeah.
that was answered.
And so anytime we would do that, that would be warned as a subcommittee meeting. And, we would have probably Deb and Beth join us for that. Not always Chris. It was actually pretty rare Chris joined us for that.
Okay. Other questions? Okay, I didn't do what I intended to do in terms of the SBA annual conference. I intended to ask people to describe different sessions, and I never got to it. So maybe we'll make just a couple statements tonight, and then maybe in a future board meeting, we'll talk about some of the specific sessions that we attended. So, Andre?
I attended what was labeled as restorative justice, but the theme changed to restorative practice by Obang, and I think his philosophy is rather than justice, let's couch it as a practice. And it was good. It was, I think, short, and it could have been a longer discussion, but I think it was a good step to couch it in a different theme rather than justice, but practice.
Andre, do you have any takeaways from the FISBIT or FEHI meetings? Or do you want to think about that for a future meeting?
I'll think about it for future.
Okay. Kim, is there anything you'd like to say tonight?
We had an awesome opportunity, Beth, myself, Jamal, and Tess, two high school students, to share our engagement around the vision and the work that we did last fall and was coming up this. It was I think very well received. I don't know that I've seen evaluations or anything, but I walked away feeling really proud of the way our community, the way we sought so much input on the vision, and continue to be blown away by our students who just present this work with heart and passion and experience, having done it in so many more places than certainly I have, in so many different ways. And I think we did one of the exercises with all of the participants that can evoke a lot of emotion and response, and it was really interesting to hear where people are. There's a lot of resentment around Act 46 out there, and I think some of the language that came through, you just want to be able to sit with people and help them understand the opportunity to be better together and think about all of our kids. And some people just are really not in that space at this time. And I hope they find a way to open their minds and hearts to that way of thinking as they move through this next phase. But I enjoyed the opportunity to present with Beth and the students.
The students were amazing. They were. Patrick?
I think the one that I got the most traction from was one about diversity in workplace recruitment, which I think actually struck home particularly for us. Asking Beth some questions, we have a very, very white teaching staff, and our children, our students are becoming more diverse. So it was Curtis Reed put it on, and it was a series of suggestions and explorations into how districts in Vermont can try to recruit minorities, individuals of color, outside of just posting on School Spring, getting local, also white students, and the impact that has on minority students being able to see someone who looks like them, in a position of power, teaching, whether it be their classroom teacher, an administrator, whatever. And Beth had mentioned that they had already started to have some discussions about that kind of lack of staff diversity that we have here at EWSD and how they can go about rectifying it. So I think it would be something, we can certainly maybe ask Beth to follow up on, because I would like to see some more traction in that area for us.
Brendan and Diane were both there, so if we talk about this at a future meeting, hopefully they'll have some things to add. I would just say that the annual meeting went really well, and I think we went through 19 resolutions in less than half the time we spent last year on many
like
fewer.
5 or 6.
I think the fact that they put out the videos ahead of time made a huge difference. So that was good. Okay, board meeting self-evaluation. Liz, do you
Yeah.
want to talk about
Brian,
this?
I sent you an email with that, if you could pull that up. We created, as you saw, I received it just today, I saw, this evaluation, and really, as it said, it's really just, to evaluate our effectiveness on a more regular basis, as opposed to just the once a year sort of big evaluation. We were hoping for some monthly check-ins, check-ins after each meeting, as was the habit at ETSD, and we borrowed this evaluation form largely from what they did in the town, and have fit it to our purposes. So it's pretty straightforward and will take no time at all, and we're hoping that after every meeting, the board will just take a minute to let us know how we are all doing.
And the form is going to come to you and me, or just me? I've forgotten.
I think, my understanding was that you were gonna be the only one to see the responses. We could do it however you'd like, but what my understanding was that we would all fill it, and you would see the responses and theme it and report back to us the themes as you see fit. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yep.
Yeah, so it's a way to try to improve our meetings as we go on.
Do you want Laura and I to fill this out?
I do, yeah,
Yes.
definitely.
Yeah.
You got it in your inbox,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, we were really, yes, absolutely.
Okay, questions? Thanks for your work on this.
Sure, no
Appreciate
problem.
it. And Kimmy, and Kim. Okay, future, let's talk, before we talk about future agenda, the next meeting is scheduled for the 20th, that's vacation week. I know Kimmy will be here, she might be able to connect remotely. Kim is not available. I don't know about you guys.
I'm available if we wanna
Okay.
do it, but I
So,
prefer not to.
since it is a vacation week, we wondered if it would make sense to move the meeting to the 27th. We would still have our meeting on December 4th, but December 4th is the day that, a meeting that we reserved for community engagement. The conversation we've been having is about using that meeting to debrief what happened with transportation. And then our thought is that in January, we would try to bring someone in who is familiar with policy governance. We would tell them about this issue that we had and ask them how policy governance would have handled that issue, so that we would have a real life practical application of how policy governance might differ from how we operate. So that's the discussion we've been having. So what do you think about moving the meeting to the 27th? Kim?
I'm comfortable with that. I'm a little concerned about having a community engagement about transportation.
No, it's
No,
not
no.
community engagement,
You
I'm
think-
sorry.
That's how it was on the calendar.
Because we're doing the big community engagement on the 1st. That's gonna be the community engagement.
Okay.
So the 4th is just a time for the board and the administration to try to analyze what happened with transportation and what should happen differently if a similar situation arose in the future. Okay? Yes.
I didn't think we were ready to have
No.
one 3 weeks from now.
Kim?
I think, and I apologize, I could totally be remembering it wrong, but I was I was thinking we were gonna do board learning that December 4th meeting, not necessarily about policy governance, but just we collectively as a board haven't done any like group training, and I thought that we were, I did not think that I recalled that we were ready for a debrief on transportation since we're not done with it yet. But I apologize if I am remembering that
was
wrong.
the discussion we had. Well, we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
It's
either
gonna
way, it's not
be-
gonna be a regular
right.
board
It's not
meeting
gonna be
as
a
much
regular
as a,
board meeting, it's gonna be a board conversation of some kind. Okay, anything for the agenda on the 27th?
Can we
That-
did we
discuss
decide it's the
holiday
27th?
Oh, yes,
before agenda?
okay, I'm sorry.
But we did decide the 27th, Martha?
Are we decided we're moving the meeting to the 27th? Okay, Marla.
Okay, last year we did the cards that we're all signing tonight, we gave them to the schools and central office and certain departments, and we did some, some cheese and crackers, fruits and vegetables. I'm not sure, we didn't spend a whole lot of money the way I did it last year, is I ran by Brian how much everything was gonna come to, and he gave me the okay whether we had the money in the budget or not. The issue I've got this year is from so many months out of work, I don't have the time off to be able to lead the effort and do it, because that day takes a good, almost solid day of your time running the platters around to, even with the help of Kim and Martha and Patrick, it's,
Yeah, I think maybe like after break.
so I didn't know if we want to continue doing this or just stick with the cards this year.
Cards.
We did get a lot of positive feedback last year, for what it's worth. Everyone was very thankful. We got specific notes, I think, from everyone. So, I mean, I do think it's a positive gesture that we can make to
Yeah.
staff. I mean, I would be inclined to see if we can get someone to volunteer their time and continue
Yeah.
doing it.
It was nice in past years because there was, it was smaller. The schools that we did it in the junction, it was smaller, so people were willing to do things for us and help deliver them, but it's too big a process now. So CTE, when I had asked them last year, it's too big for them, it's too big for a couple of other, the other thing I would recommend if we do it, that we do it earlier in December and get it away from when it's so busy just before a school holiday.
So we basically ordered things from Hannaford and then, Martha, ordered things from Hannaford and then 4 of us did the deliveries.
And I don't mind setting that up and doing the ordering and everything, I just honestly can't be there that day to be delivering to
You will
schools.
do the ordering. I'll do some delivering. It's the ordering
I
that,
can join the team of delivering, but I
okay.
should not be put in charge
No,
of
I don't
figuring out
mind
which
doing
food baskets.
the ordering, I can do all by phone.
I like driving.
And Brian will tell me honestly if the money is, I think we were under 1,000 last year, if I remember correctly.
And once we understand how many baskets Central Office West will be getting.
Yeah.
Patrick, are you available to help this year?
Depending on the day, but if we make it a Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday, then I'm in.
Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday, okay.
Sounds good to me
If
as
people
well.
send me dates, what would help if people send me dates in December when they're not available, then that would help.
So let's,
Begin, like in what week of, I was gonna say?
Like a week,
The
yeah.
week of the 10th?
Wednesday, Thursday, Friday.
Yep.
And then, let's send Marla, let's send you the dates that we are available. on Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday.
Is that, do you think the week of the 10th, or are you even thinking earlier than that?
I think, by the time we met, I think 10-ish works out well, because then to get it there by lunchtime.
No, the week of the 10th.
Oh, the week of the 10th. I think that's early enough, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the 17th is the last week of school.
Yes.
And the only other thing I would suggest, and maybe they were just all gone and it was no big deal, but if we were to do a Friday, it would be not something that would carry over if there was anything left over for the next work day.
Yeah.
So I wonder
So we
if
should
the
probably
Friday would.
see if we can do a Wednesday or
Wednesday.
Thursday. That makes sense, Kim, thanks. Okay, so we'll send dates to Martha, or we'll convene right after the meeting. Maybe we can figure it out. Does anybody have anything out of the ordinary for the agenda on the 27th?
I'd like to see the Alpine presentation. I'd like to see how it's presented to teachers and how that data is actually used
System.
with students.
Which presentation?
Alpine.
It's the new data system. I'm just trying to figure out if that's real board work, or if we should try to figure out
We
different opportunity for interested board members.
We have invested a lot of
Right.
resource in that
And
system. And so from familiarization as to how it's being used, what it is, how it presents information.
Don't you think, Amy, you did that at the last meeting, Keely?
I like the idea of there being sessions for board learning about systems like that. Like, I would love to understand how the transportation modeling system works.
Yep.
Because I often am like, can we do this with it? Who knows?
Right.
And like when Laura and Grace were talking about flipped classroom, like that's something that I'm very familiar with. So it might be that there's lots of things that we can learn about how our district works, but maybe not all of them belong at the public board meeting, but at a like separate opportunity.
Kim and I will talk with Beth and Brian at our next agenda meeting to see what might be appropriate. Okay.
I think because the student reps wanted to see it happen, I think the flipped classrooms with one of their teachers coming in to a board presentation or something would show a lot of respect to them, rather than us going and observing it. I think it was asked and well done, and they're putting a lot of work into this.
Let us think about the best way to do that.
Okay.
Okay.
I had a agenda
Yeah.
question. This probably is not for November 27th necessarily, but I feel like one of the things that, regardless of what governance model we're in, we've often talked about the board being able to do is outreach and advocacy for things that are important. And some of those issues came up around like communicating with groups like the municipalities and homeowners associations around snow removal. But I think there's a lot of things that have come up in our discussions in the transportation subcommittee that involve outreach and advocacy beyond the board. And this doesn't just have to be transportation, but just thinking about like how we interface with sidewalks, biking, public transit, bike paths, lighting in public places where kids will be in the dark.
It's the planning too, just the planning of the infrastructure to support transportation, for example.
And also, like, when I was researching the Vermont statutes, I saw that in the statutes, it says that the Secretary of Education's duties include make recommendations to school boards regarding transportation policies. So there are ways in which we could think, you know, maybe there should be a statewide conversation about the school bus driver shortage and how school districts can employ people in mixed jobs. I feel like we should start a conversation about how we reach out to other governing bodies about things that are important to us.
Right.
There used to also be a process, I don't know if you continued it from the past, but the board meeting with their legislative reps And that's taken on a lot of different ways, but a lot of times it was a advocacy and an information process, especially in things like mandates or so forth. What's the impact that the board sees sometimes by what happens in Montpelier?
So that's something that could be a first step that we could think about. We'll have a group of newly elected legislators. I remember that I wrote to Dylan about something that I wanted to advocate for. I'll go back and find that email. But I think, we could start with that, and then we could continue those conversations. We've done that in different forums, but I think the best form is just to have them come to a beginning of one of our meetings and have a back and forth conversation. So let's think about that. Anything else for the 27th?
We have first quarter financial review.
Good.
Some discussion about budget process, and I think you're due to do the formative assessment on the superintendent.
Yeah,
So those are,
I was thinking that's December, but we should start putting the materials out.
Yep.
Yes, yeah. Okay. All right, takeaways from this meeting.
Student report.
The student report.
Student report.
Policy, transportation.
At 173 and transportation. Yeah,
Yep.
that's it.
Okay.
I think your special education service plan, the overview.
Yeah, I said.
Oh, you did. I'm
173.
sorry, I missed
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Okay. All right, thank you, everyone. We are adjourned.